Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Daniel Avery. I was 34 years old when all of this happened, in late May of 2023. I was out in the Maine wilderness, not far from Baxter State Park, headed toward a place called Blackwater Lake. If you've never heard of Blackwater Lake, there's a reason. The locals don't talk about it, or if they do, it's with a wary shake of the head and a warning about cursed land. At the time, I dismissed all that talk as superstition. I was a freelance photographer, a city guy trying to prove he could do an extended solo trip off the beaten path. I thought I could capture some unique, unfiltered images and post them to my travel blog. I believed it would be a chance to recharge, clear my mind after a rough breakup, and escape from the constant noise of daily life. I'm not a survivalist or a military veteran. I'd done weekend camping trips plenty of times, but I was no expert. I had, however, a decent sense of caution, or at least I thought so. I had the proper gear, a sturdy tent, water filters, a sat phone for emergencies, a small supply of MREs, and of course, my dog, Scout, who was a 6-year-old Labrador Retriever. He was my best friend, loyal, sweet, never far from my side. If I had known what awaited us in those woods, I never would have brought him. I never would have gone at all. I arrived at the start of the remote trail, really just an overgrown path that veered west of Baxter State Park, early in the morning. The plan was to canoe part of the way along a winding river that would eventually feed into Blackwater Lake itself. It was a calm, cloudy day. The trees towered tall, the pine needles thick on the ground. No other hikers in sight, not that I expected to see any. The black flies were in full force, the mosquitoes even worse. But I was determined, excited, full of naive optimism. I had an image in my mind. Me, standing on a pristine lakeshore at dusk, snapping a perfect photo of the sunset across the still water. I parked my car on the side of a dirt road. No official parking lot, just a small clearing, apparently used by hunters in the off-season. I unloaded my gear, strapped on my large backpack, and secured Scout with a harness. He wagged his tail and pranced in circles. My canoe, an old fiberglass job, I slid carefully down an embankment into the river. We took off. It took a couple hours on the water to get close to the lake. The trip itself wasn't dangerous or wild, but as soon as we drifted beneath a thick canopy of overhanging branches, something felt wrong. It's hard to describe. Maybe the air got heavier. Maybe there were fewer birds singing. A Scout, usually eager to sniff along the shoreline, sat tense in the canoe, ears twitching. I tried to ignore the odd vibe. I carried a cheap smartphone and an older model sat phone as a backup. The smartphone was basically for pictures or quick journaling if needed. Even early on, I noticed the battery was draining faster than normal. Within an hour, it had dropped from a full charge to 50%. By the time I reached the campsite I'd spotted on a map, it was down to 25. That was unusual, but not impossible. I told myself maybe the phone was getting old. The campsite was just a semi-flat patch of land near the water, ringed by tall pines and thick brush. I beached the canoe, hauled my gear onto shore, and started setting up camp. Scout bounded around but avoided the water. Usually he loved swimming, so I made a mental note that was odd. Maybe the water was just too cold. I was in a good mood, though. I pitched the tent, hammered in the stakes, then laid out an old tarp for a seating area. About an hour before sunset, I gathered kindling and broken branches for a campfire. With a few flicks of a lighter and some tinder, the flames took hold. Meanwhile, Scout sat near me, occasionally whining, looking over his shoulder at the trees as though he expected something to step out at any moment. I patted his back and tried to reassure him. The sun dipped. The lake took on a mirrored surface. It was beautiful in an eerie way, like the water was a black mirror. Maybe an hour after sunset, the wind changed direction and seemed to carry a faint, rancid smell, like something decaying. It was so light I wasn't sure if I imagined it. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a crunch in the nearby brush. Scout let out a single deep bark, then went silent, hackles raised. My heart hammered, but I reminded myself that wildlife is common. Could have been a deer, or even just a raccoon. A few minutes passed, no more sounds. Scout eventually lay down, head on his paws, still facing those trees. I tried to lighten my own tension by documenting the day in my travel journal. Day 1. Surreal. Found a campsite near Blackwater Lake. Phone battery is draining oddly. Scout is spooked. I feel unsettled, but not sure why. I turned in early, pulling Scout into the tent with me. It was a sturdy 2-person shelter. I wasn't too worried. Nothing else happened that night, or at least not that I was aware of at the time. But in hindsight, I had a nightmare that left me waking in a cold sweat. Visions of shapes slipping through trees, strange eyes in the darkness. It might have been a stress dream from the long day. The second day began with me rising at dawn to the sound of crows, or maybe ravens, loud and grating. My phone was down to 10% battery. No missed calls, no texts, no reason for such a drain. I cursed under my breath, plugged it into a solar charger, and left it outside the tent in the growing sunlight. The day was bright, if cool, and the forest seemed a bit friendlier. I reminded myself that the first night in a new place always feels a little off. That's normal. This was the true start of my adventure. After a simple breakfast, instant coffee, and an MRE, I set out with Scout to explore around the lake on foot. The plan was to circle the shoreline and maybe find interesting vantage points for photos. I carried my DSLR, the rest of my gear locked away in the tent. The trail that encircled the lake looked straightforward on the old paper map I had. I didn't trust the phone's GPS, especially with the bizarre battery issue. We walked for about an hour, skirting the edge of the lake. The trees here were tall, older than the ones near the main trail. The underbrush was thick, and the ground was spongy, covered in moss and pine needles. The map indicated that the northern tip of the lake would feed into marshland, but as we progressed, none of the features matched. The land rose instead of flattened, and the shallow, reedy areas I expected to see simply weren't there. I pulled out my compass. It spun almost a full circle before settling. That's not normal, but compasses can fail, especially cheap ones. So I shrugged it off. The place was silent. I mean really silent, no birdsong, no rustling in the bushes. Even the breeze felt stifled. Then came the stench again. It rolled across the path like a wave of rotten eggs and wet fur. Scout tucked his tail between his legs and whimpered. It got stronger as we pushed forward. I nearly gagged. A few minutes later, we found the source. The carcass of a moose sprawled across a clearing, half sunk in some kind of muddy depression. The eyes were gone. No surprise. Scavengers always go for the eyes first. But the horrifying part was the rest of it. The jaw was missing, and yet there was no blood, no typical gore. The wounds looked burned or melted, as though someone had pressed a red-hot iron along the muzzle. The flesh around the neck and ribs was somehow cauterized. I felt my stomach revolt. Scout let out a series of short, fearful barks, and I had to shush him. What could do that? Bears, wolves, vultures, they leave a different kind of mess. This looked clinical in a way, or maybe the opposite. Like it was done by something that had no business existing in a normal forest. I took a few photos. Maybe that sounds gruesome. but my photography instincts kicked in automatically. As I tried to zoom in for detail, I noticed my DSLR's battery was almost empty, though I'd charged it fully before leaving home. Strange, I got a handful of shots, maybe 5 or 6. Then it died, just died. We backed away, and I tried to map out a different route to get around that clearing. The stench followed us, as if it clung to my clothing. As we continued, the ground sloped again in ways that didn't match any contour lines. Finally, after hours of wandering, it felt like we were moving in circles. My paper map might as well have been for another planet. I kept track of time on my watch. Around 2 p.m., we stumbled back onto the original campsite. I realized we had made a complete loop somehow, despite believing we were forging ahead. Scout was shaking. I was exhausted, frustrated, and unsettled. And that's when I met Caleb Hill. I'd emerged from the trees, sweaty and panting, only to find a man standing near my tent. Scout started barking immediately, but stayed behind my legs. The man wore a ragged jacket and cargo pants. He had a scruffy beard, short brown hair, and a wary look in his eyes. Next to him was a small pile of gear, a battered backpack, and an ancient canteen. He raised his hands as if to say he meant no harm. "Didn't think anyone else would be out here," he said. "Figured I'd borrow the campsite for a bit." At first glance, he looked like a typical outdoorsman, maybe a hunter or a fellow traveler. He introduced himself as Caleb, said he used to do Forest Service work in Maine, but left a few years ago after something went sideways. Didn't elaborate, claimed he'd been out here hiking for a few days, heading in the direction of Blackwater Lake. Said his directions got screwed up. I told him I was also having trouble navigating. We both half joked that the forest was messing with us. He didn't laugh for long, though. We talked, establishing an uneasy companionship. After some hesitation, I told him he was welcome to camp next to me for safety in numbers. I even offered him some of my leftover coffee. It felt good to have another human to talk to not be alone. Scout let him pat his head after a few minutes, which was surprising, considering how on edge Scout had been. As evening set in, I worked on lighting another campfire. The wood was damp, and for some reason the flames kept sputtering. Finally, I got it going. Then the fire flickered green for a moment. Caleb noticed. We shared a concerned glance but said nothing about it. Neither of us wanted to admit that something was just wrong here. I heated an MRE. Caleb had his own dried goods, mostly jerky and nuts. We swapped small talk, comparing notes on the land. Caleb insisted the place didn't match any official forest maps. Claimed he'd used a standard topographical chart, but everything was out of place. Sometimes ridges would appear where the map promised a valley, or a crevice would open in the ground unexpectedly. It was reminiscent of illusions, or maybe the forest was playing tricks on us. He asked why I was out there. I explained about my photography blog, how I wanted to capture images of untouched Maine wilderness, maybe even discover a hidden gem in the process. He gave a humorless chuckle. "You found something, all right," he said. That night was worse than the first. I couldn't get comfortable, and Scout paced in and out of the tent. At some point, I woke in pitch darkness to the sound of heavy breathing right outside the tent wall. It wasn't Scout. He was lying next to me, trembling. The breathing was loud, raspy. I thought maybe a bear had wandered into camp. I held my breath and listened, heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, it shifted away, the rhythmic crunch of brush fading. In the morning, I discovered footprints around the tent. Not boots, not bare feet, hoofprints. They circled the tent multiple times. It looked like deer or moose, but the prints were strange, elongated, with small cracks in the earth at the edges. I recalled the moose carcass and felt bile in my throat. Caleb swore under his breath when he saw them, He knelt, traced the outline with a trembling finger, then turned to me, eyes dark. "This isn't right," he said. "It's not normal." We spent a frantic half-hour checking the perimeter. The footprints wandered into the lake as though the creature had simply walked beneath the water. Then we both realized something else. Our food was spoiled. All of it. Caleb's jerky was furry with mold. My sealed MREs smelled rancid. Scout's bag of dog kibble had turned to green sludge. It made no sense. MREs and kibble are designed to last for months or years, especially if unopened. With our supplies ruined, we had to consider bailing on the trip. That meant hiking or canoeing back to the vehicle. But when I went to check the canoe, it was still there, though it felt heavier. As I prodded it, the bottom had grown soft, as if the fiberglass was rotting. Caleb and I exchanged a look that was part fear, part disbelief. I told him we'd attempt to use it anyway. Better to risk it than remain here. That was the moment I realized Scout had vanished. He was here just a moment ago, sniffing around the edge of camp. Now he was gone. No bark, no whine, nothing. Panic spiked in my chest. I called out for him, yelling his name over and over. Caleb and I split up, circling the immediate area. The trees swallowed our voices. No sign of my dog, not a single track except the hoof prints leading into the lake. After a fruitless search, Caleb offered to go deeper into the woods on his own, in case Scout had chased an animal. I was torn about letting him go alone, but I was desperate to find my dog. We agreed to meet back at the campsite in an hour, so he vanished into the pine forest, leaving me to stare into the black water, calling Scout's name until my throat hurt. When the hour passed and Caleb didn't return, my anxiety spiked again. I was torn between waiting or going after him. Eventually, I began scouring the area, but the land was so twisted that after half an hour I couldn't tell if I was going in circles. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps approaching. It was Caleb, carrying Scout in his arms. Scout's head lolled. I rushed over, adrenaline surging, and realized Scout was alive but trembling and covered in dirt, as if he'd been half buried somewhere. I asked if he'd fallen into a hole. Caleb didn't answer right away. He was breathing heavily, pupils dilated. I found him near something, he finally said. Some kind of mound. He was just lying there. Relief hit me in a wave. "Thanks," I said, hugging Scout. He whined softly, but something was off about his eyes. He refused to make eye contact with me, staring over my shoulder instead. Also, there was this smell on him, like old pond water or sour mud. But I was so grateful he was alive, I let it slide. Caleb looked different too. As we headed back toward camp, he asked me odd questions. "Do you remember how many days you've been here?" His voice was calm, too calm. He kept smiling, more a grimace than a smile. I told him it was day 3. He nodded, repeating day 3, like he was working a puzzle out loud. I assumed he was shaken by the search. Scout refused to eat or drink. He just sat near the fire pit, eyes fixed on some random spot in the distance. At one point, I tried to coax him with water from my canteen, but he pressed his ears flat and growled. He'd never once growled at me before. Caleb quietly watched, expression unreadable. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I noticed the glow from the dying embers. Caleb was humming a tune, 4 notes repeated over and over. I asked what it was. He just stared at me with that same unwavering smile. I let it go, lay back down, tried to relax. When I checked my watch a bit later, it read 3:12 a.m. I tossed and turned, drifting in and out of fitful half-sleep. At some point, it felt like hours had passed. So I checked the watch again. 3:12 a.m. still. My watch hadn't stopped ticking. I could hear it faintly, yet the time didn't change. I tapped on it, rewound the dial. It sprang forward to 3:15. I lay down, dozed off. Woke again, what felt like an hour later. The watch said 3:12. I tried to flip on my phone's flashlight to see if the phone clock was working. The phone was dead, not even a flicker of battery life. So I lay there in the dark, heart pounding. Meanwhile, Scout twitched in his sleep, letting out these weird half yelps. A sense of dread rose in my throat, and I couldn't explain why. It was as though the world had lost all sense of normal time. At dawn, or what I assumed was dawn, given the lightening sky, I crawled out of the tent and found the entire campsite in disarray. The fire pit was scattered. My backpack was zipped open, contents spilled. Caleb was just standing there, staring into the water. My sleeping bag was lying unzipped on the ground, but from the inside, as if someone had crawled out of it through the closed zipper. The hair on my arms stood up. "Caleb," I said, approaching him, "you okay, man?" He turned to face me. His left eye was bloodshot, and the corner of his mouth twitched, but he spoke in a calm, almost kind voice. "I'm fine. It's just getting clearer now." "What's getting clearer?" I asked. My mind was spinning, exhausted, alarmed. He pointed into the water. At first, I saw only my reflection, but as I peered closer, I realized the reflection wasn't me. The face was twisted, half-rotted, with blank eyes. I jolted back, nearly losing my balance. Caleb let out a soft, humorless laugh. We spent most of that morning trying to figure out a way out of the forest. We decided to attempt the canoe, rotting or not, because the alternative was to hike in circles. We packed quickly, though we had little in the way of supplies left. Scout was still refusing to eat, but he followed at my side. The bright side, the dog at least seemed responsive, not wandering off. I took that as a small mercy. As we pushed through the brush, heading back to the canoe site, Scout stopped and let out the saddest whimper I'd ever heard. He stared ahead, tail stiff, body low. I followed his gaze. We were back at the moose carcass clearing, and it was still there, but changed. The moose was propped upright, as if someone had taken lengths of broken wood and jammed them through its torso to make a grisly scaffolding. The missing jaw was replaced with what looked like a chunk of driftwood, carved to mimic teeth. The scent was horrific, rotten, chemical. I gagged, covering my nose. Caleb just stared, that small smile creeping up again. Scout trembled at my feet, muzzle pressed against my leg. We walked in a wide circle around the carcass, hearts pounding. I kept expecting something to burst out of the bushes. The trees felt like they were closing in, roots knotting across the ground. Finally, we reached the shoreline. My canoe was still there, though the fiberglass had turned blackish in places and looked soft. I tested the hull with my hand. It gave a bit, like old bread. Caleb leaned in, sniffed, recoiled. "This is diseased or something." "I don't care," I said. "We have to at least try." We set the canoe in shallow water, loading gear carefully. Scout hopped in, though he kept pacing back and forth, whining. I took a paddle, and Caleb took the other. We shoved off. The canoe wobbled on the eerily still surface of Blackwater Lake. We paddled, heading east. According to any normal map, that should have led us toward the mouth of the river that connected back to the roads. The water was smooth as glass. I kept glancing over the side, expecting to see fish or weeds, but it was so dark I couldn't see anything more than a foot below. Some part of me felt relief. Maybe we'd be okay now. We just had to keep going, don't look back. Then, about 100 yards from shore, a swirling mass of ripples formed ahead of us. It looked like something big was moving underwater. The canoe jolted as if we'd hit a submerged log. We almost capsized. Scout slipped, claws scraping the floor. I heard a crack as the hull buckled slightly. Then it was gone. The disturbance vanished. We paddled faster, hearts racing. Another 100 yards, and the terrain ahead should have revealed a river mouth. Instead, we saw only more lake, like it was stretching on forever. Caleb cursed. "We should have reached the river by now," he said. "It's impossible." He wasn't wrong. We should have at least seen the bend. Instead, the shoreline to our left and right started to look identical, repeating in some kind of pattern. We'd pass a fallen tree or a distinctive boulder, then see an identical fallen tree or boulder a few minutes later. I felt pure fear sinking into my gut. Were we moving at all, or drifting in some kind of loop? After an hour of paddling, we found ourselves near a patch of shoreline that looked exactly like our starting point. And there, unbelievably, was our original campsite. The charred ring of stones for our fire, the scattered footprints. My heart sank. We had gone in a circle on a lake that shouldn't have had any circular route. Frustrated and terrified, we pulled the canoe ashore. Scout leapt out and ran up the bank as if searching for something. That was the only bright side. At least the canoe hadn't completely disintegrated beneath us. We were back to square one, though, and that reality made me sick to my stomach. That's when I realized Caleb was staring at Scout, face twitching. He looked hungry. The best way to describe his expression was predatory. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I tried to focus on gathering my thoughts to figure out another plan, but I couldn't help noticing the tension in Caleb's shoulders, the way he kept flexing his hands. I confronted him quietly. "What's wrong? You look off." He blinked at me, then forced that crooked smile. "Nothing. Just hungry." He pointed to the rotting food bag. "We have no supplies left." I told him we'd figure something out. Maybe fish or gather safe plants. There had to be a way. He nodded, but that gleam in his eye unsettled me. That afternoon I tried to fish along the shore, fashioning a rudimentary rod from a branch and some line I found in my pack. Caleb loitered around camp, humming that four-note tune again. Scout lay near the tent listless. After hours I caught nothing. The lake was cold and still. I almost considered searching for edible plants, but I wasn't an expert. No sense poisoning myself with the wrong mushrooms or berries. The gloom of dusk settled far too quickly, like someone dimmed the entire sky. I checked my watch again. 3:12 a.m. I tapped it, tried to wind it. The second hand moved, but the time refused to change. That weird pressure in my chest returned. Something was messing with me. Maybe the place was messing with me. I breathed in and out, reminding myself to keep calm. Night fell, and that rancid smell returned. Worse than before. The Scout whined, hid in the tent. I asked Caleb to help me gather more wood for a fire. He just said, "Sure," then set off into the dark trees. After 10 minutes, I realized he hadn't come back. Normally, I'd have gone to check, but I felt this primal fear, like leaving the campsite alone would be a terrible mistake. So I waited, fists clenched around my flashlight, which was half dead. When Caleb finally returned, it must have been an hour later. He came into the ring of firelight with an armful of branches, and also a fresh cut on his forehead. He dumped the wood on the ground and smiled too wide, lips stretched unnaturally. I asked him what happened to his head, and he just shrugged, repeating, "It's fine, it's fine." He barely blinked. I noticed his boots were caked in mud, but the smell that came off him wasn't just dirt, it was the same putrid odor from before. A voice in my head screamed, "Something is wrong," but I stifled it, telling myself I was just unnerved by everything else. We got the fire going again, although the flames hissed and sparked with the greenish flares. I tried not to stare at Caleb's face. I told him quietly, "We have to leave tomorrow. We have to try hiking. We'll take the main trail, or bushwhack east until we find a road." He gave a weird nod. "Yes, but I need to do something first." "What?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just walked past me and knelt by the tent where Scout was curled up. Fear shot through my gut. "Caleb?" I said, voice shaky. That's when everything happened too fast. Caleb reached into the tent with both arms and grabbed Scout by the scruff. Scout yelped, snapping. I shouted, "Hey!" but Caleb wrestled him out of the tent. I tried to intervene, but Caleb shoved me back with inhuman strength. Scout squirmed, whined, tried to bite. Caleb pinned him to the ground. Before I could do anything, Caleb broke Scout's neck with a sharp twist. The sound of it haunts me even now. A crack, a brief whimper, and then silence. I screamed. My entire body went cold with shock and rage. Caleb let out a low, almost soothing whisper. "It's better if he can't call her." The words made no sense. Tears burned down my face as I lunged at him, tackling him off Scout's body. My dog's eyes stared lifelessly at the sky. Fury blinded me, but also fear coursed through my veins because Caleb was strong, too strong. I grabbed my camera tripod, the only heavy object near me, and swung it. The metal connected with Caleb's jaw, splitting the flesh. Blood sprayed onto the ground. He staggered, but then laughed, a wet, bubbling sound, as if he couldn't feel pain. With an almost casual move, he kicked me in the side, knocking the wind out of me. I stumbled back, clutching my ribs. He advanced, eyes gleaming with mania. I swung the tripod again, wild with grief and terror. It slammed into his shoulder. He dropped to one knee, spat blood, but kept that twisted grin. Then he scrambled away, faster than I could react, disappearing into the dark forest. I collapsed to my knees next to Scout's body. There was nothing I could do. He was gone. I cried, pressing my hand gently against his fur. Even in the flickering firelight, I could see the unnatural angle of his neck. My sweet dog, who'd been with me for 6 years, wagging his tail through thick and thin, snuffed out in a second by a man who'd come back wrong. Anger welled up, but it was almost buried under a tidal wave of horror. What was Caleb now? Or maybe the question was, what had he become? I sat there until my tears dried, until the fire had almost burned down to coals. The stench of rot lingered. If Caleb was still out there, I had no illusions that I was safe. I barely slept that night, and when the gray morning light arrived, I was still kneeling beside Scout's body. My watch, of course, read 3:12 a.m. As I forced myself up, everything felt raw. My mind swam with guilt. I should have protected Scout, I should have seen it coming. But the only thing left to do was figure out a way to survive, to escape. I used my bare hands and a little collapsible shovel to dig a shallow grave near the tree line. I buried Scout as best I could, tears streaming the whole time. I said a short, choked goodbye. Part of me wanted to flee, but I couldn't leave him. Once I finished, I found fresh tracks, human footprints mixed with something else. Trails of dried blood. Caleb's footprints? Desperate to find a real exit from this nightmare, I gathered what gear I had left, which wasn't much, stuffed it into my half-ruined backpack and turned east. No more messing around with the canoe. I'd try to bushwhack if I had to. I told myself that no matter how the land twisted, I'd walk in a straight line, using the sun's position as a guide. I needed to be vigilant for Caleb, or whatever he was now. The forest felt gloomier than ever. Clouds massed overhead, blocking out a clear sense of the sun, but I kept moving, forcing a path through the brush. The ground was soft, spongy. Time seemed meaningless. I just walked. At some point, I crossed a ridge. Peering down, I recognized a partially collapsed log across a stream. I realized with a jolt of panic that it was the same stream crossing I'd used on my first day. Somehow, I'd ended up backtracking, despite focusing on heading east. Trees seemed to shift behind me, and the wind moaned through the branches. I whispered, "This can't be happening," over and over. The stench of rot grew stronger. My heart hammered. Something was following me. I felt it. Branches snapped in the distance. Could it be Caleb again? My pulse spiked. I gripped the tripod, my only makeshift weapon, tight in one hand. As I hurried along, I nearly stumbled onto the moose carcass, clearing a second time. I froze. The sight was beyond horrifying. The moose was gone. Instead, a shape stood in the clearing, tall and lean, with massive antlers. For a moment, I thought it was another living moose, but then it turned its head and I saw the face. It wasn't an animal's face. It was a human face, twisted and stitched onto the skull, eyes wide and unblinking. My brain short-circuited, refusing to believe what I was seeing. Somehow, that thing spoke, but the voice that came out was my dog's bark, hollow and echoing, each bark drawn out. I clapped my hands over my ears, terror seizing my chest. Then the bark shifted into a voice I recognized as my own, as if replaying my desperate calls for Scout. "Scout! Scout!" It echoed, a mocking tone. My knees threatened to buckle. Behind me, I heard the undergrowth rustle. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting Caleb to leap out. Nothing. When I looked back at the antlered figure, it had advanced a few yards. Its eyes twitched in a terrifying imitation of human blinking. Its jaw moved, revealing blackened teeth behind the borrowed face. My only thought was run. But I realized I stood at the edge of a rocky ledge. The clearing extended out to a steep drop, covered in boulders. Could I lure the creature closer? Maybe push it over? It was a desperate plan, but I saw no other choice. I'd read somewhere that a moose can be surprisingly agile, but maybe this unnatural hybrid had its limits. I slid sideways along the ledge, brandishing the tripod. The thing cocked its head, muscles bunching under the patchwork hide. It lowered its antlers and charged. The speed was insane. I had only a split second to dodge, jamming the tripod between the antlers like a lance. It crashed into me, sending shocks of pain through my shoulder. I teetered at the edge, but somehow held my ground. The creature roared. Yes, roared. The sound shifting from animalistic to human shrieks to demonic growls all at once. I yanked a flare from my pack, the last bit of emergency gear I had, and lit it. The brilliant red glare made the creature reel, blinking the stolen eyes. I seized the moment to plunge a broken branch I'd spotted on the ground toward its skull. I missed the direct target, but caught it along the left side, near what might have been an eye socket. It howled, rearing up on hind legs. The weight of its own body teetered. Then it slipped, dropping into the chasm, smashing against a rocky outcrop, bouncing once and rolling out of sight. Adrenaline roared in my veins. I pressed myself against the ground, panting. Distantly, I heard a wet, crunching sound. Then silence, except for my ragged breathing. Did I kill it? My mind was screaming that I needed to run, but I had to be sure it was gone. I got to my feet, carefully peered over the edge. I saw movement among the rocks, its body broken. But even from that distance, I saw its limbs shifting, reversing, the flesh rotting and then reforming before my eyes. It looked like time was playing backwards for it, broken bones snapping back into place. I stumbled away, half in shock. There was no question in my mind now. Something beyond all reason was infesting these woods. I needed to get out. I limped through the forest, battered and starving. No water left. No food. My lips felt cracked, my head ached, and the stench that permeated everything made me want to vomit. I don't know how long I walked. Time truly had no meaning. Eventually, I found the place where I'd left the canoe. The rotten husk of it lay half on the shore, half in the water. Worms or maggots wriggled through the wood. My heart sank. Any last hope of using it to escape was dashed. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. My travel journal was lying on a rock. I was sure I'd left it in my pack or in the tent. Yet here it was, open, pages flipping in the wind. I picked it up, half expecting to see scribbled nonsense. Instead, I found an entry that described in perfect detail everything that had happened up to that moment. Scout's death, the rotting canoe, the moose creature. My hand shook as I read words I knew I never wrote. Toward the bottom of the page, a new paragraph began. "You will read this again, Daniel." The date, ironically, was the day after tomorrow. My stomach lurched. The edges of my vision blurred. I reeled, feeling faint. This was impossible. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. Someone behind me. I spun around, brandishing the tripod. No one. Only the whisper of the trees. On the shore, I saw footprints, human footprints trailing away back toward the Maine forest. They weren't mine. I sat on a fallen log, clinging to a sliver of hope that I could somehow, someway, outrun whatever was happening. With a trembling hand, I peeled back the next page of my journal. It was blank, except for one sentence in the center. "She is waiting in the water." I slammed the journal shut, too terrified to look more. My mind raced. The only option was to try to return to my car on foot. I was disoriented, but maybe if I followed the water's edge downstream. If any real path existed, maybe I'd eventually find the road. The alternative was to die out here, or worse. I found a bit of rope, still intact near the canoe, used it to tie up my battered pack so it wouldn't fall apart, and forced my legs to move. I wish I could say I made it out of that forest easily, but reality, once again, refused to cooperate. I limped along the lakeshore for hours, maybe days. The only measure of time was the changing sky, from dull gray to midnight black and back again. I slept maybe twice, each time dreaming of horrifying landscapes, twisted creatures, and the face of Caleb, smiling with blood-stained teeth. At one point, I found the remains of some old dirt road, or maybe it was a logging route. It led me deeper into the trees, but I clung to it as my best bet. Then, in the distance, I saw a figure. My heart leapt in fear. Could it be Caleb? But as I got closer, I saw it was Scout, sitting upright waiting. I froze. I'd buried him with my own hands. But there he was, wagging his tail softly, eyes black. The world swam, and I felt the edges of madness. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispered that it wasn't real. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. Only old pine needles and a faint echo of a dog's whine remained. I kept staggering on, half delirious, until I reached a place where the forest gave way to a slight clearing. The sun was going down again, and I had no shelter. My throat was parched, lips cracked. I found a small pool of water near a cluster of rocks. Likely just runoff from the lake, but I was desperate. I filled my canteen, used a filter straw to try to purify it. Gulped it down in greedy swallows. The water tasted foul, metallic, but it eased my thirst a bit. Then, stepping away from the pool, I noticed footprints in the mud. The same elongated hoofprints that had circled my tent. My entire body locked in fear. A few yards away, the trees parted to reveal a single deer skull balanced on a tree stump. It had something scrawled across the bone in a black substance that might have been tar or blood. I couldn't read it, as it was in no alphabet I recognized. The dryness in my mouth returned. I left, quickly, not wanting to wait and see what put that skull there. Night fell fully, and the air turned freezing. With no tent or sleeping bag, I gathered what branches I could, desperate to start a fire. My hands shook so badly I could hardly manipulate the lighter. Each time I struck it, the flame flickered out. By the time I finally coaxed a tiny blaze to life, it was nearly midnight, or so I guessed. The flames licked at the wood, turning it from orange to a sickly green. I huddled close, arms around my knees, trembling. I don't know how long I sat there, hours. Finally, I drifted into an exhausted sleep, only to be ripped awake by a voice calling my name. Daniel! Daniel! It wasn't Caleb's voice. It was female, soft, almost familiar. Could have been an illusion. My instincts told me not to answer, but my loneliness was overwhelming. I got up, stumbling toward the source of the call. The forest was pitch black, the only light from my dying fire behind me. I fumbled with the flashlight, got it to flicker weakly. The voice continued, "Daniel, please." I followed it until I realized it was coming from behind me now, near the fire. I spun, scanning the trees. Nothing. The hair on my neck prickled. They're toying with me, I thought. I rushed back to the fire, nearly falling over a gnarled root. The voice faded into laughter, then silence. No more sleep that night. I just stared into the embers, gripped by dread. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By what might have been the next morning, I managed to find a faint game trail heading east. Driven by primal survival instinct, I followed it. It led me through stands of twisted pine, across rocky outcroppings, and finally to a place where the trees parted enough to give me a glimpse of sunlight. My heart soared. Maybe I was free at last. Maybe I'd see a logging road or a highway. Instead, I saw a patch of forest containing my car, parked there, in the middle of the trees, as if the forest had grown around it. I ran to it, tears of relief flooding my eyes. I tried the door, locked, as I left it. I fumbled for my keys, unlocked it. The interior was dusty, but the faint smell of coffee from my travel mug still lingered. I laughed in near hysterical joy and tried the ignition. Nothing. Dead battery. I slapped the steering wheel in frustration. Checking the back seat, I found a couple gallons of water I'd left as emergency backup unopened. Thank God. I gulped down a bottle's worth, feeling delirious from dehydration. Then, behind me, a branch snapped. I spun, looking out the back window, expecting to see the moose thing or Caleb. But I saw nothing. My adrenaline was too high to sit there. I popped the trunk, rummaged for anything I could use. Found an old tire iron, a blanket, a half-charged portable power bank. I plugged it into my phone, hoping to at least see if the phone would boot up. Miraculously, it started charging. The screen came to life. The time read 3:12 a.m. The date was nonsense, a scrambled series of letters. Over the next few minutes, the phone gained a little charge. No signal, of course. Not even a hint of service. But at least I could use the flashlight if it came to that. I looked around. The forest was silent, except for my ragged breathing. The sense of time was hazy, but the sun overhead told me it had to be midday. Part of me wanted to stay with the car, build a giant signal fire, hope someone would find me. But I feared staying in one place, especially now that I'd drawn attention. I decided to keep moving. My rationale: if I found a real road, I could always come back for the car with help. So I grabbed the spare water, the blanket, the phone, my battered tripod, and slung the bag of essentials over my shoulder. I paused, half expecting the forest to shift around me, to swallow the car again. I prayed it wouldn't. Then I took off, forging east once more. I don't know how long I walked. The clouds rolled in overhead, blocking direct sunlight. My phone's battery died again, abruptly. I had no sense of direction except a gut feeling that east was the way out. At times, I thought I saw shapes flitting between the pines, but I never got a clear look. My mind was frayed, my nerves raw. Eventually, I heard the faint roar of something that wasn't wind. Cars, maybe? I followed the sound, stumbling over roots and brush, pushing branches aside, my chest filled with a fragile hope. The noise grew louder, and then I saw it. A gravel road winding through the forest. An actual man-made road. Relief crashed over me. I practically tumbled onto the gravel, knees scraping. The pain was almost a joy, proof that something real existed. Now, all I had to do was wait for a vehicle, or start walking along the road until I reached some sign of civilization. And that's exactly what I did. I walked. My feet ached, my body filthy and bruised, but I walked. The sun began to set. I worried I'd end up in darkness again. But then I saw headlights in the distance. A battered old pickup truck. I waved my arms, weeping with joy. The truck slowed, the driver, a middle-aged man with a cap, rolled down the window. "Christ, bud, you look half dead," he said in a thick Maine accent. "You out here alone?" I babbled some story about getting lost, about the impossible forest. He gave me a confused look, but offered me a lift to a nearby town. I didn't question it. I climbed in, shaking from relief or shock or both. He even gave me a bottle of water, which I gulped down like a dying man. "Name's Roger," he said. "What the hell you doing so far off the trail?" I started to explain about my photography, but I could barely form coherent sentences. He nodded politely. The radio crackled with static, but at least it was a normal, real static and not some demon voice. We drove for about an hour along that gravel road, eventually hitting a more paved route. My entire body screamed in pain, exhaustion pulling me into a half-doze. Finally, we reached a small town, a diner, a gas station. I barely remember the details. Roger insisted on dropping me at the diner, where the waitress called the local authorities. An ambulance arrived. They checked me out, gave me IV fluids. My entire story, at least the part about being lost in the woods, was taken seriously enough. But when I tried to explain everything about the rotting moose, time loops, possessed men, they all gave me that pitying look people give when they think you've gone off the rails. I left Maine a few days later, as soon as I could retrieve my car. Miraculously, it was found near some old trailhead, in the same place I'd originally parked it. No sign of it being in the middle of the forest. The local sheriff just shook his head when I asked if it had been moved. He speculated I'd got turned around, and that maybe my dog ran off, though that didn't explain the shallow grave or the footprints. I drove home, trying to piece my life back together, haunted by the memory of Scout's death, the stench, that monstrous moose creature, and the twisted grin on Caleb's face. At night, I dream of hoofprints circling my bed. I dream of the time stuck at 3:12 a.m., of stepping outside and seeing a lake that shouldn't be there. Worse yet, I still have my journal. The final pages remain blank, except for a single line scrawled at the bottom in my handwriting. You're going to read this again. Sometimes, when I look out my apartment window at the trees lining the street, I catch a glimpse of a shadow with antlers. A figure that vanishes before I can fully register it, and in those moments, I'm not sure I ever truly escaped. Maybe I left the forest, but something followed me. I catch myself humming those 4 notes, the same tune Caleb hummed. And sometimes, late at night, I find my watch still reading 3:12 a.m., no matter how many times I set it right. I tell myself it's only trauma, it's only nightmares. But a part of me knows better. Whatever was lurking in the depths of Blackwater Lake, it's not done with me. If you ever see mention of that place on a map, or fail to see mention of it, that might be your warning. Stay away. Because once it has its hooks in you, once it warps your sense of time and self, there may be no true escape. Still, part of me wonders if I should go back. Maybe I've lost my mind. but I can't shake the feeling that the story hasn't ended. Late at night, I hear Scout's bark echo down the hallway, and if I look at just the right angle in the mirror, for a split second I see a stitched-on human face, wearing antlers like a crown, smiling at me through empty eyes. Whether this is a curse, a haunting, or a tear in reality, I can't say. I only know that it started with me wanting a peaceful trip, wanting to take some photographs of a quiet lake in the Maine wilderness. It ended with nightmares beyond belief, with the loss of my dog, the destruction of a man's sanity. And if you read these words, especially if you find them scrawled in a journal that doesn't belong to you, close the book. Turn away and forget you ever heard of Blackwater Lake, because something out there is waiting and it's very, very patient. I wish you better luck than I had. My name is Emily Harrow. I'm 29 years old. This happened in August of 2023, when my life was already a wreck and I thought a 3-night hike would help fix everything. I don't really know if sharing it will help anyone else. Maybe it's just to remind myself I survived, that I didn't imagine it all. When I look back, part of me wishes I had never set foot in the Bigelow Preserve. But another part of me, the part that needs to know there's more to the world than just my heartbreak and my own anxieties, is still enthralled by what I experienced in those dark woods. I'd lost my job that spring, let go from a software startup that decided my department wasn't integral. Then, 3 weeks after that, my ex-boyfriend decided the best way to handle my meltdown was to vanish from my life. A text message, a few boxes dropped on the porch, a key under the mat, poof, gone. I was alone in a crumbling apartment, with no money, no prospects, and too much time to think. My best friend Jess insisted I shouldn't isolate. She said I needed to get out of my head, that the big city was messing with my sense of self. Jess had seen me at my best and worst, but never quite this low. She conjured up an idea. A real backwoods Maine hike. Just me and her, no phones, beyond using them for pictures. Real physical effort. Sleeping in tents, clearing the mind through sweat and nature's indifference. She convinced me the best therapy was to let the forest reset me. Jess Caro is 30, sarcastic as hell, and ironically hates being more than a stone's throw from a Starbucks in daily life. She's a trauma nurse in downtown Boston, the type of person who can handle blood and gore at 3 in the morning but will squeal if she sees a mouse scuttling under a cabinet. She always said she loved horror movies, but had never tested that fondness in a remote, real environment. Part of me wanted to see how she'd handle it. Another part was scared that I'd be too depressed to appreciate the chance at healing. But we planned anyway, mapping out a loop trail around the Bigelow Range in Maine that would take 3 nights, maybe 4 if we slowed down. We told ourselves it would be an easy introduction to a deeper wilderness experience. The Bigelow Preserve, near Flagstaff Lake, wasn't the final frontier, but it was rugged enough to make you feel small and separated from the rest of civilization. So, on a humid day in mid-August, Jess and I rolled into the parking lot at the base of a side trail leading up to the Bigelow Range. We stuffed our backpacks with freeze-dried meals, water filters, small stoves, and sleeping bags. I felt a small pang of excitement. This was the first time in months I was looking forward to anything. A pang of fear followed. What if I failed at this too? We started hiking. The day was bright, the sky a powder blue. Jess wore bright red hiking pants that she joked made her look like a lost tourist. I wore my well-worn green cargo pants and a shirt I'd gotten during a volunteer trip years back. A piece of my old, optimistic self from a time before I understood real heartbreak. The forest soon swallowed us. The trail turned into a corridor of conifers, pines thick on either side, the air starting to cool. I was sweating, adjusting my pack, but feeling oddly content. Things started subtly. Jess's phone wouldn't pick up location data, so we tried mine. Mine worked for about half an hour, then started glitching, showing us crossing the entire state in seconds. We laughed it off. We had compasses and a topographic map anyway, real old-school navigation. Jess teased me about my tech-addicted generation, even though we were basically the same age. I teased her back. Our conversation was full of that friendly, mocking banter that feels good-natured and safe. We made the first campsite near Horns Pond around 4 in the afternoon, a clearing with fire rings set up by the local trail association. I remember thinking it was too easy. Sure, it was a decent climb, but I felt like we'd only just begun. We found a spot in the woods to pitch our small dome tent, well out of sight of the main trail, but near enough for safety. The only problem was a quiet heaviness to the air. It was like stepping into a sealed room in an old house, slightly stagnant and charged with static. The night started with laughter. We built a small fire, gathered deadwood from around the site, and prepared freeze-dried beef stroganoff. Jess joked about the wonders of powdered dinner. It was a proud moment for me, feeling normal again. No job stress, no heartbreak. Just the two of us, the crackle of a fire and the looming silhouettes of pines. But halfway through the night, as the moon rose, the flames in our pit turned a bluish-green. At first, I assumed we must have burnt some chemical-laced trash by accident. But all we had thrown on the fire was the same branches used earlier. Jess tried to pass it off as copper in the wood. Maybe some old pipe or something. She sounded unconvinced. We let it burn a while, neither of us wanting to make a fuss. Eventually, we turned in. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Jess and I each had a sleeping bag and a small foam pad. My last memory was Jess zipping her sleeping bag and murmuring, "We'll do about 10 miles tomorrow." Then I drifted off. I woke suddenly. A scratching noise outside. I froze. The kind of freeze that you feel along your spine. An instinctive fear. I listened. Nothing. Then the faintest hum, like a child singing a lullaby. The hairs on my arms shot straight up. I rummaged for my phone to check the time, forgetting it was basically useless. No signal. The phone read 12:03 a.m., but it could have been any hour for all I knew. I whispered, "Jess?" She didn't respond. The hum continued, but it was so faint it could have been my imagination. I considered unzipping the tent and shining a light around, but the idea of a child humming in the middle of nowhere made my stomach churn. I told myself maybe it was the wind through the pines. I forced my eyes shut. I must have eventually slept, because the next thing I remember is a morning light stabbing through the tent fabric. Jess was already outside, going through her bag. I poked my head out. The air felt cooler than the day before, maybe mid-50s, with condensation everywhere. "Morning," I said, noticing Jess's uneasy expression. "You were messing with your sleeping bag last night?" she asked. I thought about the strange hum, but not about messing with my bag. I didn't even get up. She turned and showed me her sleeping bag. It lay unzipped on the ground, the zipper wide open. I woke up around dawn, freezing my butt off. This was unzipped from the inside. She pointed to the inside handle. "I asked if you got up or something, and you were still dead asleep." Maybe she had undone it in her sleep. She'd probably pulled it open during a dream or restless night. "You were definitely tossing and turning," I said, not entirely sure if I was fibbing or not. She just stared. "We should eat and move. Got a lot of ground to cover." We made breakfast, or tried to. Jess discovered her bag of oats had turned a dull gray color and had a rancid odor. I teased her that she must have let moisture get in, but she insisted she'd sealed it perfectly. The other odd moment was my water filter not fitting onto my bottle anymore, like it had warped overnight. small problems, but each was unsettling. Still, we got enough water and decided to get on the trail. The first few hours were almost normal. The forest was quiet, with the occasional scurry of squirrels or birds overhead. The sky was bright again, but there was a subtle haze that left shadows looking elongated. The path turned steep in places. Jess groaned about it, occasionally cracking jokes to lighten the mood. We pressed on. By midday, we reached a ridge with a stunning view of Flagstaff Lake below. Though something about the water's surface, seen from that height, made it look darker than usual, almost black. We took pictures, trying to keep the mood bright. I dared to check my phone. Time read 1:12 p.m., battery at 73%. Fine. Jess's phone was dead. She'd plugged it into a power bank that apparently had gone dead as well, which was odd since it had been fully charged the day before. But these are the kind of minor annoyances that can happen off-grid, so we shrugged. We kept hiking, turning east. That's where everything began to go sideways. The trail markers we were following were faint. The map I had indicated an intersection that never appeared. My compass spun slowly, as if it couldn't find north. Jess tried to blame magnetized basalt in the area, but neither of us was sure. We walked circles. We reached a signpost marking a side trail to Horn's Pond. We recognized it from the day before. Impossible if we'd actually been traveling east. It shouldn't have been physically possible, but there we were, at the same signpost from that morning. Jess's face was tight with confusion, but also real fear. Maybe we'd overlooked a second sign that was a copy. We tried to rationalize it. We turned around and decided to blaze a new path forward, carefully using the map. We set off again. We ended up back at that signpost within an hour. My breath came quicker, panic building. Something was off. Jess started cursing, insisted we just pick a direction and keep going. We did, but the forest seemed bigger and the trail narrower. Everything felt more enclosed, as if the trees themselves were shifting. The day dragged on. The air turned thick, an oppressive heat returning. Our compass remained useless, the needle swinging lazily. Eventually, we found an old side trail that we decided must lead in the direction we wanted. We took it without caring it was unmarked. By the time we found a clearing to camp in, the sun was setting. If the map was correct, we should be near the southern edge of the range, possibly close to a different route leading out. But that was guesswork. We made camp in a smaller, more tangled patch of forest. The trees pressed in like watchers. Jess's expression was grim. "We might be lost," she said, stating the obvious. I tried to reassure her that we'd handle it in the morning. As we set up the tent, my stomach twisted in knots. A child humming, the glitching compass, time loops on the trail. I kept telling myself we were just disoriented, maybe in mild shock. But I remembered that hum from last night. Something was waiting out there. Jess tried to make a fire. The kindling was dry enough, yet every time she got a spark, the flames immediately sputtered out in swirling smoke. We tried again and again, even used a dab of stove fuel. It flickered, then died. Finally, we got a small, feeble fire going, but it glowed with an eerie greenish tint. We ended up piling more wood on, ignoring the color, just desperate for heat. Jess was quiet the entire time. She sat across from me, arms around her knees. "It feels like the forest doesn't want us here," she said at last. "I know," I said, "but let's wait. Tomorrow we'll figure out the route." We tried to eat. Our leftover freeze-dried packets had gone foul, smelling like rotting eggs. We'd stored them in sealed plastic bags, no holes. Yet something got in. So we settled on some trail mix that, thankfully, tasted normal. Exhausted, we decided to sleep. We crawled into the tent, zipped it up. Jess turned to me, eyes wide. If you hear anything. She couldn't even finish the sentence. The idea of a child's lullaby in these dark, lonely woods felt too weird to say aloud. I was half asleep when I heard footsteps circling the tent. I froze in place, and then a giggle. It was definitely a young girl's voice. It stopped after maybe 5 seconds. I was shaking, my heart pounding. But Jess didn't stir. I don't know if she was awake or had fallen asleep. I just lay there, forcing myself to remain still, telling myself it was a dream. The footsteps circled once more, leaving behind the faint rustle of leaves, and then silence. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Jess rustling outside. I poked my head out of the tent and nearly gagged. Our food supply for the day was sitting in the center of the clearing. A stinking, moldy mess. The packaging had somehow shredded as if left to rot for a month, but it had only been a single night. Jess looked pale and shaken. "What the hell is happening here?" she asked in a half-whisper. I had no answer. My only solution was to say, "We keep moving." We loaded what little salvageable gear we had. The air smelled stagnant, that same sealed room smell. My watch read 6:50 a.m., Jess's watch read 2:15 a.m., and neither matched the sun's position. It felt more like 10 in the morning to me, bright and overhead. We decided my watch must have died. Hers must have died. Everything was just breaking. We tried not to talk about how improbable it all was. We walked north, or so we thought, stumbling over roots and rocks. Jess was quiet. The mood was grim, desperation creeping in. We were hungry. We needed real food soon. We had water at least. Jess used her filter. It seemed to work, though the water tasted metallic. We carried on, weaving through thick stands of pine until we found the main trail again. Or so we thought. The path vanished in spots, reappeared in others. The forest floor was churned, footprints leading in circles. A headache formed behind my eyes. Jess rubbed her temples, complaining of the same. The sense that we were walking in loops got stronger, so we decided to go off-trail, picking out a direction and keeping it no matter what, so we'd eventually cross a known route. That's when Jess saw the cabin foundation. I wish to God we'd never investigated it. Part of me thought it might be a shelter, or maybe a place to get help. But it was just a skeleton of old stones, half buried in the moss, with a collapsed wooden frame leaning precariously. Moss and fungus covered the remains of an ancient door. A chimney stood intact, blackened around the top. It looked to be well over a century old. Jess moved to the door, pushed, and it creaked open in a way that made my stomach flip. We stepped inside. The space was maybe 15 by 20 feet. Bare walls, charred along the inside as if a fire had gutted the place. The floor was an uneven mixture of dirt and rotted boards, and scattered across it were small shoes, half burnt, laid out in a row. Next to them were lumps of melted wax. They might have been dolls at one point, their forms congealed into something formless. The wax had hair embedded in it, real human hair from the look of it, and scraps of fabric. Jess's hand flew to her mouth. The shoes were child-sized, all scorched around the edges. A wave of dizziness hit me. Something felt so wrong. The air was suffocating, like the night was pressing in on me under broad daylight. Jess stepped back, tears in her eyes. "I can't. This is..." She didn't finish. We left the foundation, stumbling away with a sense of panic growing. About 100 feet from the structure, Jess saw a crude cross in the ground, stuck haphazardly in a pile of rocks. On it was an old brass plaque. In memory of Clara, our beloved daughter, 1880 to 1892. My entire body tensed. The child's shoes, the wax dolls. I felt something shift around me. The forest fell silent, as if the birds and bugs had collectively stopped breathing. Jess started talking too fast, voice trembling. "We have to get out of here. That's it. I'm not messing around. We find the next route out, or we bushwhack straight toward the roads. If we break an ankle, we break an ankle, but we can't stay out here." I nodded, swallowing the raw fear that threatened to make me cry. We stumbled back into the tree line with no sense of direction, just an urgency to escape. Time seemed impossible to track. My phone was at 6%, flickering. The sun kept drifting behind clouds that slipped in and out of the sky with unnatural speed. I'd glance up and see bright sunshine, blink, and then gloom. We heard no animals at all, no scurrying, no birdsong. The only sound was the wind pushing the branches. We discovered a faint path that had to lead away from the preserve. We followed it in silence until we saw a small pond, dark, still water with a narrow beach of grayish sand. I recognized it from the map. Horns Pond. We'd circled back again. We might have screamed out in frustration, or maybe not. My memory of that moment is fuzzy. I just remember the deep dread. Jess sat on a rock, burying her face in her hands. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "We're not incompetent. Why are we going in circles?" I put a hand on her shoulder. "Jess, maybe we just calm down, get water, keep going, or we set up camp and start again tomorrow." She glared up at me. "Another night out here?" She took a deep breath, then softened. "I'm sorry. I understood. It was beyond fear. It felt like we'd stepped into a nightmare world where nothing made sense. The best I could do was try to keep us moving, but the day was already sliding away, the sky darkening. We had no more than an hour of light, if that. So, we resigned ourselves to a third night in the wilderness, right near Horns Pond. Jess forced a joke about how we'd come full circle. We pitched the tent in a new spot, near the water's edge, but just under a stand of pine. We tried to fish, but the pond was murky, nothing biting. Our stomachs grumbled. We ended up eating a few leftover snack bars, which mercifully hadn't rotted yet. It was pitch black within minutes, as if someone had hastened the sunset. Jess tried to keep a small lantern going, but it flickered. I wanted to gather more wood to attempt a fire, but she insisted we stay near each other. I gave up. We crawled inside the tent. Jess was trembling, a cold sweat on her brow. I tried to calm her. "Just hold on," I whispered. "Tomorrow, we head west. The roads are that way. We'll go in a straight line if we have to." She nodded, her face streaked with tears. "I want out," she murmured. "I never should have come." I held her hand until I felt her breathing slow, and then I tried to sleep. All the while, I could sense something outside. The hush of the pines. The hum of that lullaby. I heard it again, I'm sure of it, the same childlike voice carrying on the breeze. My skin prickled. I wanted to jump out of the tent, run screaming into the night, but I didn't. I forced myself to remain. A suffocating dread pinned me to the floor of that tent. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke to a rustling and realized Jess was gone. The tent flap was open, the outside pitch black. My chest constricted with panic. I scrambled out. "Jess!" My voice cut the silence. A damp breeze chilled me to the bone. The forest around me was so dark, the kind of darkness that plays tricks on your eyes, forming shapes that might be watchers. I called her name again, stumbling over roots. I found Jess near the edge of a Horns Pond, standing perfectly still. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but enough light reflected on the water to see her silhouette. She stood with her arms slack at her sides, her hair shifting in the breeze. I walked forward cautiously. "Jess?" She turned her head a fraction, enough that the moonlight hit her eyes. She smiled, but it was too wide, like a caricature. "I'm just gathering wood," she said in a flat voice. Her tone was so empty that every alarm in my body rang. She lifted her empty hands. "Not much wood, though." I swallowed, reaching out. "Hey, come on back. Let's do it in the morning, okay?" She nodded, but just stood there, staring at the lake. That smile plastered on her face. "Jess, are you okay?" Her smile grew. She turned to me, fully now, and her eyes were watery, vacant. She said, "Don't you like it here, Emma?" That word, Emma, hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the name of her younger sister who died in an accident when Jess was in her teens. Jess rarely talked about her, and certainly never confused me with Emma. I felt my knees go weak. She took a step toward me. I backed up. "Why are you frightened?" she asked. Her voice was melodic, childlike. "You're scaring me," I whispered. "Let's go back to the tent." She cocked her head as if trying to interpret my words. Then suddenly, she took a staggering step forward as if losing her balance and nearly collapsed into my arms. Her entire body trembled. The grin melted away, replaced by confusion. "Em," she whispered, using my actual nickname. "What's going on?" I helped her back to the tent, terror swirling in my stomach. She claimed not to remember why she'd gone to the shore. She was so cold to the touch, I thought she might have hypothermia. Once inside the tent, she lay there shaking. She eventually fell asleep, or at least that's what it looked like. I watched her for hours, too afraid to sleep, until exhaustion overcame me and I drifted off. When I woke, it was full daylight. Jess was nowhere in the tent. The zipper was open again. I rushed out. She was in the clearing, rummaging through our gear, a frantic expression on her face. "Emily, the backpacks are gone," she said in a trembling voice. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, scanning the campsite. We'd put them right by the tent's entrance. Sure enough, they were missing. Panic clawed my chest. "Did you move them?" She shook her head. I tore around the campsite, checking behind trees, calling out. Nothing. The packs with our scant supply of clothes and the few leftover bars were gone. Jess found them an hour later at the signpost we kept encountering. The same sign for Horns Pond, half a mile from our campsite. The packs were just laid out in the middle of the trail. Jess was breathing hard when she brought me there. "Who would do this?" she asked. All I could do was stare at the battered signpost. We had not come this way in the night, I was certain. The rest of that day was a blur. We attempted to follow the trail outward again, crossing small ridges, weaving through pines. We found fresh footprints in the dirt, small, child-sized footprints. At first, I convinced myself it was a trick of the soil, or maybe some other hiker's kid. But they appeared in places no child should be able to walk easily, climbing steep rocky sections. When the sun set, we realized we hadn't eaten all day aside from a few nuts we found in the pocket of Jess's jacket. We were starving. Our water supplies were dangerously low. The night came fast, almost instantaneously, as though time had lurched forward. We made the worst camp yet, right off the trail. Jess wouldn't speak. She just lay down in her bag, eyes wide open, refusing to look at me. I was losing her. I felt it in my gut. That night, I dreamt of a little girl with stringy hair standing by my tent. She sang a tune, low and wavering, words I couldn't make out. I woke to see the outline of someone standing over Jess inside the tent, but it was too dark to see details. I screamed and scrabbled for my flashlight. The shape was gone in an instant. Jess woke with a start, panic in her eyes. She scrambled backward, feeling around. A fresh cut was on her wrist, shallow but bleeding. "What's happening?" she sobbed, voice trembling with confusion. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling around us in violent gusts. The entire tent shuddered. We heard a girl's laughter echo, though no body or shape was visible in the clearing. Jess whimpered, pressing her hands to her ears. My own ears were ringing. I crawled over to her, tried to stanch the bleeding with a bandana. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "If we have to run all night, we—" A heavy gust collapsed aside of the tent. Jess and I scrambled outside, ready to abandon everything to flee, but as soon as we did, the wind died. The forest was still. Silence. I heard only our ragged breathing. Jess stared around, eyes wide. "I can't stay here," she murmured. She started to run, or tried to, but in her delirium she tripped on a root and collapsed. I helped her up. We stumbled forward, ignoring the gear, chasing any chance to find a real trail or a road. The moonlight illuminated the path for maybe a quarter mile until we reached a slope of jagged rocks. Jess clung to my arm as we climbed. The wind started again, howling through the pines. We were half mad with exhaustion by the time we reached a small plateau. A sign of hope flickered. In the distance, lights, maybe from a house or car, I couldn't be sure. Jess tried to speak, but then her breath caught. She clutched her head in her hands, crying out. The air around us seemed to shimmer like heat rising off asphalt. Suddenly, Jess straightened, her eyes calm, her posture eerily composed. She turned to me and said in a voice not her own, "It's easier if you don't fight." My blood turned to ice. She advanced on me, limbs jerking like a marionette. "Don't fight," she repeated, with a wide grin. "Jess?" I managed, stepping back. She lunged. I gasped, nearly toppled. Her nails raked my arm, drawing blood. "Let her in," she hissed. "Just let Clara in." My mind spun. Clara, the child, the ghost, the presence. My best friend's body was a puppet now. She came at me again, a wild slash with her hands. I blocked, tears in my eyes. She was strong, unnaturally so. "I won't," I whispered, fighting back the swirl of fear. "Jess, I won't. Snap out of it." I shoved her away. She stumbled but then twisted back to me too quickly. In the moonlight, I saw something behind her eyes, something that wasn't Jess. I scrambled for a rock or something to defend myself with. She advanced again, pinned me against a boulder. Her breath smelled like rotting leaves. She pressed her forearm to my throat. "Don't fight," she repeated. That grin now a rictus, her eyes wide, tears rolling down her cheeks as if some part of Jess still existed inside, terrified. I forced my knee up, driving her back just enough to slip free. I grabbed a tent stake from my jacket pocket. I'd stuffed it in there by instinct when we fled. She lunged. I swung the stake, catching her in the shoulder. She let out a strangled cry, stumbled back, and for a moment, the expression changed. She looked at me with real human sorrow. "Em?" she croaked in her normal voice. But the unnatural grin snapped back. She let out a ragged breath, spat blood onto the ground. I didn't want to hurt her, but something was wearing her body, something determined to make me let it in. I kept the stake raised, tears blurring my vision. She charged me again, shrieking, with a voice that didn't sound like Jess at all. A childlike wail overlaid with a raw, guttural moan. In desperation, I spun and smacked her behind the knees, and she collapsed. Before she could scramble back up, I put my weight on her, pressing the stake against her neck, not to stab but to restrain. She struggled, thrashing. My heart pounded in my ears, frantic with the knowledge I was hurting my best friend. For an instant, the clouds shifted. Pale moonlight bathed us. Jess went limp, her eyes focused on mine, for real. "Emily," she gasped. "Kill me or run." "She won't let me go." My breath caught. "Don't let her have you." Fresh tears poured down her face. I can't hold on much longer. Jess, no, I sobbed, pressing my forehead to hers. I wanted to tear that evil out of her, fix her, anything but the impossible choice she gave me. She shuddered, body convulsing. Her eyes rolled back. I felt her chest heave. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm sorry. Then something snapped in her body, like a switch flipped, and she gave a violent spasm that threw me off. She clambered to her feet. When she turned, her face was blank. Enough, that childlike voice said. You want her? Take her. Then Jess's own arm swung the stake around and drove it into her own side. I screamed, lunging forward to stop her, but it was too late. The stake went in. She staggered, and that wide grin flickered on her face once more. Her lips moved. She only needs one body. The words were Jess's voice, but they sounded so distant, as though Jess was a ventriloquist dummy. Blood dribbled over her hand. She stumbled backward, toppling off the edge of the rock plateau, a short, sharp drop into the darkness. I scrambled to peer down. The moonlight lit the slope below just enough for me to see Jess's body crumpled awkwardly in the brush. Her chest was moving, but no sound emerged. I slid down the rock, scraping my legs raw. By the time I reached her, her eyes were open but sightless, staring up at the sky. I felt for a pulse, found a weak flicker. The stake was still in her side, angled upward. She gasped, blinked once. Her face softened, free of that grin. She breathed a single word. Run. And then her breath rattled out. I pressed my hand to her neck, half screaming her name. My voice echoed around the silent forest. She lay there, eyes still open. My best friend was gone, taken by something I couldn't see or name. I don't know how long I knelt there, sobbing and shaking. At some point, I noticed the air swirling, that stagnant hush replaced by a crackling tension, as if the forest was waiting for me. A small hand fell on my shoulder. I jolted, turning. No one was there, but I felt it, a presence behind me. Adrenaline took over. The survival instinct that Jess had told me about. The one that sometimes keeps trauma nurses going through a night shift. I got up, tears still flowing, and stepped back from Jess's body. I wanted to carry her somewhere, give her a decent burial, but I was out of my mind with terror. I forced myself to gather my strength. I'm sorry, I whispered. Then I turned and fled into the trees. I ran. Branches whipped my face. My arms stung from thorns. I ran until my chest burned, until my vision blurred. Finally, my body collapsed against a tree. For a moment, I believed I'd outrun that presence. Then I heard it. A low humming, right in my ear. I jerked away, spinning. An outline of a child flickered between the trees. Dark hair, a pale dress. She stared at me without blinking, her face half in shadow. My heart hammered. I stumbled away, half limping, half running. The child drifted, not physically chasing. It was more like she made the forest turn in on itself to corner me. The path I took twisted me back toward the pond. Through the trees, I glimpsed the water. I smelled the rotten stench of algae. Then I saw the old cabin foundation, the place with the scorched shoes. It was as though the entire preserve had shrunk to this diabolical labyrinth, funneling me where it wanted. I ended up at that foundation again, breathing raggedly. The child was nowhere to be seen, but I felt her. A single candle burned among the melted wax. Yes, a candle flickering in the middle of that blackened ruin, even though there was no sign of who lit it. I stepped inside, my body shaking. The floor felt wet. I looked down. Old boards were rotting, spongy, as if saturated with water or blood. A wave of nausea threatened to topple me. I stumbled to the opposite wall where I found a worn plaque. Clara Hollings, born 1880, died 1892, taken too soon. our precious daughter. I recognized the name from the cross by the pond. Something had happened here. Fire, tragedy, maybe some twisted ritual. Now the child's spirit roamed, searching for a body to claim so it could be alive again. And it had nearly taken Jess, had partially taken her, used her to kill herself. The enormity of that horror seized my mind. I wanted to collapse into madness right then and there, but a flicker of movement at the door made me turn. The little girl stood there, half her face blackened as if scorched by flames, the other half a porcelain white cheek. She wore a dress that might have been from another century, ragged at the edges. Her eyes were impossibly wide, catching the candlelight. She smiled, gently. Somehow, that was more horrifying than if she had scowled. I backed against the foundation wall. "Stay away," I choked out. She didn't speak. She just took a step forward. My legs shook, but I raised my arms as if to fight. I had no weapon. The child regarded me with something like pity or curiosity. Then she lifted her hand. She gave the slightest wave as though beckoning me. My head swam. I felt that time distortion again. Flashes of images soared through my mind. My father's funeral, my ex-boyfriend's smug face, Jess's final breath. It was as if she was rummaging through my memories, rewriting them. At one point, I saw a memory of Jess's eyes that first night at the campfire, except now it wasn't Jess's face at all. It was Clara's, smiling at me across the flames. I dropped to my knees, pressing my hands to my temples. "Stop," I whimpered. "Stop, please." The child drifted closer, the hem of her dress dragging on the ruined floor. For a second, she seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if she wasn't entirely there. I mustered my last shred of defiance. I lunged for the candle, hoping maybe destroying it would do something. I snatched it up, ignoring the hot wax. The flame wavered. The child hissed, her eyes darkening. I threw the candle onto the damp boards, rubbing it out with my boot. Then I kicked the melted forms of old wax dolls, scattering them. The air crackled with tension, and the child's face contorted. A noise like a storm's roar filled my ears, and the floor of the foundation buckled, throwing me backwards. I landed on my back, my breath knocked out. A swirl of black smoke or shadowy form erupted from the place where the candle had been. The child let out a high-pitched wail that hurt my eardrums. I crawled backward, trying to escape. She rushed at me, flickering in that same stuttering way. I found the remnants of the old chimney half collapsed behind me. There was a loose piece of iron from the fire grate. I grabbed it, a shard of rusted metal about a foot long. When she was inches away, her mouth open in a silent scream, I swiped the metal at her. It passed through her shape like it was smoke, but she froze, flickering, as if it somehow disrupted her. I didn't waste time. I jumped up and bolted out of that ruin, ignoring the throbbing in my hip and the spinning in my head. The forest was changing around me. The sky flickered from night to day, or so it seemed. I would see the sun overhead for an instant, then total darkness. My watch beeped at random intervals. The digits scrambled. My breath came in ragged gasps. At one point, I passed a giant pine that was half blown apart. Later, I came upon the same pine with no sign of damage. I could hear the child's footsteps behind me, light, skipping. The wind whispered, "Clara wants you," over and over in my own voice. I realized the only place left to go was out of the preserve entirely, if that was even possible. Jess had told me to run, so I ran. I forced myself to keep a straight bearing, ignoring illusions around me. Several times I heard Jess's voice behind me calling for help, whimpering. I refused to turn around. I knew it wasn't her. I pushed forward until the trees began to thin out. Then I nearly cried with relief when I saw the edge of a gravel service road snaking through the woods. I stumbled onto it, my legs giving out. The moment I set foot on that road, the air seemed to lighten. The forest behind me was still thick and ominous, but there was a sense of separation, like crossing an invisible boundary. I lay there, chest heaving, tears falling. Eventually, a passing park ranger in a truck found me. He must have been doing patrol. I barely remember it. I was delirious, scuffed up, and bleeding. He kept asking me what happened, if I was alone. I tried to explain Jess was still in there, but I think I blacked out because the next thing I recall, I was in a hospital bed with bright white lights overhead. They say I was dehydrated and had severe exhaustion. My feet were infected with some kind of nasty fungus or rot. I might lose a few toenails. The ranger never found Jess. The official story is that she was lost in the wilderness, still missing. Search parties combed the area, found no sign of her or any remains. I tried to tell them where to look, about the crumbling cabin near Horns Pond, but they insisted they found only the remains of an ancient foundation with no body inside. I told them about the stake, about Jess's final words. They gave me sympathetic looks. I was the traumatized friend, the delirious survivor. My best friend is gone. The official search ended after a week of 0 leads. The only footprints they found were mine, apparently. I told them about Clara's footprints, the small shoe prints near the cabin. They said I must have left partial footprints that got distorted in the mud. They believed I was simply traumatized. But I know what I saw. I know Jess was taken. I'm out of the hospital now, but I can't sleep. I keep seeing that wide grin on Jess's face. I see the swirling campfire with its blue-green flames. Sometimes I see the child in my living room, humming that lullaby with her eyes locked on mine. I'm not sure if it's just nightmares or if something followed me. But now, in the quiet moments, I catch a reflection that isn't quite mine in the mirror. I see flickers of a child behind my eyes, feel a presence brushing against my thoughts. I know Jess told me to run, to keep Clara out, but I also know Clara is still out there waiting, searching. Maybe for me. Maybe for someone else wandering that remote corner of Maine. If you ever find yourself hiking the Bigelow Range and your compass won't hold north, if your campfire burns the wrong color or your supplies rot overnight, run and don't look back. She's there, and she wants a body. I can still hear Jess's voice telling me to get out. I did, barely, but I left her behind, and I'll carry that guilt forever. Sometimes, when it's too quiet and I'm on the verge of sleep, I hear a child's giggle or the hush of footsteps around my bed. And I think maybe I didn't really escape. Maybe there's no escape from Clara at all. Because the last time I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw my own reflection blink, but I didn't blink. And the eyes staring back were too wide, too dark. There was an echo of a grin at the corner of my mouth. And in that fleeting moment, the reflection mouthed a single word. Emma. Then it was gone. I'm telling you, the Bigelow Preserve is haunted by something old and hungry. And I think it's only a matter of time before it comes for me or for you or for anyone else who dares enter those dark woods and stumbles upon the final resting place of a little girl named Clara, who died in 1892 but never really left. Maybe I'll wake up someday with her memories as my own, losing pieces of myself until only that wide smile remains. Maybe my face will be the next one beckoning from the shadows, calling some unsuspecting hiker deeper into the gloom. All I can do now is try to stay in the light, keep my mind busy and hope. Hope that Jess's death meant something, that her last words telling me to run gave me a fighting chance, because if it didn't, then I'm already as lost as she is, still wandering that lonely forest in spirit, while my body roams the world with someone else wearing my skin. I wish there was a neat conclusion, but there isn't. The darkness of that place clings to me, and I've seen enough to know it's far from finished. You can believe me or not, I don't care anymore. All I can say is, if you value your life, stay away from Horns Pond. Don't listen to the child humming in the night, and never, ever let her in. My name is David Rowe. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in October of 2024. If you ever see headlines about a mysterious occurrence in Bigelow Preserve, Maine, or read a small blurb about a weird missing person case, you might think of me. You'd think of me if you knew the details anyway. The thing is, nobody truly does, at least not the way I experience them. No official record exists of exactly what happened, or how many people were out there, or what we faced. No one believes my story. I'm telling it here because I need someone, anyone, to know the truth. I need to get it all out before the nightmares consume me for good. I was raised in southern Maine, near Portland. After my father's passing last spring and my divorce just a few months later, the world felt like it was caving in. I'd lost both my greatest mentor and my closest companion in less than a year. The cracks in my own psyche seemed to widen. One day, I realized that I needed to do something drastic just to breathe again. So I planned a wilderness retreat. A week off the grid in Bigelow Preserve near Cranberry Peak. I wanted solitude. I wanted to remember that the world was bigger than my problems. I had a dog, Rex, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, who had been my loyal shadow for most of his life. Rex was my constant comfort, especially after my divorce. To me, he was basically family. With that in mind, I decided the trip would be me, Rex, and a tent, with no distractions. The plan: park near the main trailhead, hike deep into the preserve, set up a base camp by a small stream, and stay put for 5 nights. I'd bring my phone for emergencies, but no laptop. Maybe some books, a sketch pad. That was it. I had, of course, researched the region. Bigelow Preserve is rugged, mountainous, with rocky trails and thick evergreen forests. The nights in October can get cold, and weather can change fast. I'd done a bit of hiking in my younger days, but I was by no means a wilderness expert. I had enough sense to pack extra layers and freeze-dried meals, plus a portable water filter. My father had taught me some basics about fire starting and orienteering, but I wasn't a pro. I just wanted to escape everyday life for a little while. All of that was the plan. That's all it was, until my old friend Nathan Briggs showed up at my door unannounced. We'd gone to high school together, but we'd barely stayed in touch for 15 years. Our lives had taken separate paths. Nathan was the same age as me, but seemed to have lived a lot harder. He had a slight tremor in his hand and a haunted look in his eyes, as though he'd seen things he wouldn't talk about. He asked if he could come with me. I was surprised he even knew about my plan. Turned out he'd talked to a mutual acquaintance, found out that I was going camping, and decided he could use a break from his own troubles too. At first, I wanted to say no. The entire point of going was to be alone with Rex, to find quiet. But I saw something in Nathan's expression, desperation. Or maybe I just didn't want to push away the last fragment of my old social life. Either way, I said yes. I told him, "Sure, you can tag along if you don't mind roughing it." Nathan just gave me a weary grin and said, "The rougher, the better." There was no reason to suspect how bad it would get. If anything, I was oddly relieved. I'd lost so many people recently. Now, I'd have a friend. And we left it at that. We left for Bigelow Preserve on a crisp Monday morning. The drive from Portland took almost 3 hours. The last stretch was on narrow roads where cell reception dropped to near zero. My phone's battery was full, though, and we had paper maps. Rex sat in the back seat, occasionally popping up to stare at me or at the passing trees. The further north we went, the more the autumn leaves burned orange and red. The color was breathtaking, and I started to feel that sense of peace I'd been craving. When we finally reached the small parking area near a trailhead, we found only one other car, a dusty pickup. Perfect. I locked my car, adjusted my heavy backpack, and we set off. The trail was well marked for the first few miles. We passed some day hikers, two older gentlemen who greeted us warmly and gave Rex a pat on the head. They said they were heading out soon, as the nights were getting too cold. When we said we'd be staying 5 nights, they gave us a polite but dubious look. Still, they wished us luck. After about 3 miles, the path branched. The left fork continued up toward the main ridgeline and was obviously the standard route. I chose the right fork, which, according to my paper map, descended toward a stream. We had no real trail name on the map, just a dotted line, perfect for solitude. I'd read that sometimes fishermen used it to reach certain pools, but it wasn't maintained. We walked for a good 4 hours total. The terrain got rugged, and we had to scramble over fallen logs and slide down a loose rock. We finally arrived at a relatively flat patch of ground near the water. I guessed it was around 4 p.m., and the sun was already angled low behind the pines. "All right," I said, dropping my pack. "Here we go." Nathan wiped sweat off his forehead and grinned. "This is off the beaten path, man, like, seriously off." Rex bounded around, sniffing everything. I set up my small tent while Nathan put together his own. We found a decent place for a fire ring, cleared away debris, and soon had a neat, if rustic, campsite. Once the tents were up and the sleeping bags unfurled, I figured we had a bit of daylight left to gather wood. That was the first time I sensed something off. As soon as I started walking deeper into the trees, my compass needle spun oddly, stuttering on north. I tapped it, shook it. The needle corrected, but I felt a little tingle of unease. Maybe my compass was just cheap, or there was a natural magnetic anomaly in the area. Not unheard of. We collected enough firewood to last the night. By the time we got back, the shadows had grown long, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I tried my phone, out of habit. No service. That was expected, but the phone was acting sluggish too. The battery read 70%. It had dropped from full to 70 in a matter of hours with no real use. I brushed it off. We got a small fire going. Nathan cracked open a can of something to eat while I boiled water for my freeze-dried meal. Rex dozed near the warmth, ears occasionally pricking up at nighttime rustles in the undergrowth. The sky darkened quickly. Clouds drifted in, blotting out the stars. Normally, I love the hush that descends in the wilderness after dark, but something about it felt oppressive that night. Nathan tried to lighten the mood with jokes about high school. He reminded me of the time we snuck out to a friend's barn to watch horror movies. I laughed, but the memory felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Then the wind picked up, and the fire's flames shifted colors, briefly flaring greenish-blue. I assumed we'd just happened to burn something with chemicals in it. Nathan cocked an eyebrow at me. "Weird," was all he said. "Yeah," I agreed, unsettled. It only took about 15 minutes for the flames to extinguish themselves. I've never seen a fire fail that quickly. The wood was dry. We had enough kindling. We tried to coax it back to life, but it sputtered and died again. Finally, we gave up and crawled into our tents in near darkness. Nathan made some snide comment. Maybe the forest is telling us to go to sleep. If only we'd listened. I don't know what time it was when I first woke. The moon must have broken through the clouds a bit because I could see some pale light on the tent walls. Rex, who'd been sleeping at my feet, was up on all fours, ears pricked, hackles raised. He was growling, a low, rumbling warning. I whispered, "Rex? What is it, boy?" He whined, still glaring at the tent door. Outside, something rustled. Footsteps. I assumed it was Nathan going to relieve himself, but the footsteps circled our tent in a slow, deliberate pattern. I tried to call out softly, "Nathan?" No response. Just that soft crunch of pine needles. My heart hammered. Could it be a bear, a curious coyote? I grabbed a flashlight, turned it on, and the light immediately flickered, then died. I cursed under my breath. The footsteps faded, as though the presence had retreated into the woods. Finally, I heard the zipper of Nathan's tent. Then his voice groggy. "David, you say something?" I exhaled in relief, though my pulse still raced. I heard something outside. Nathan stepped out with his own flashlight. Might have been me adjusting in my sleep. Don't worry about it. I pressed my ear to the tent wall. Silence now. Slowly, fear gave way to exhaustion, and I drifted back into a restless sleep, Rex eventually curling up beside me again. Morning and the first signs. I woke to the smell of rot. When I unzipped my tent, the sky was a dull gray, the sun hidden behind more thick clouds. Nathan's tent was closed, but I could hear him snoring inside. Rex was outside, pacing near the ashes of our fire pit. As soon as I looked around, I realized the smell was coming from my food bag, secured to a tree branch about 10 feet off the ground. It was a standard practice to keep it away from animals, but something had gotten into it anyway. The rope was still tied, but the bag sagged like it was heavy with water. I climbed up, cut the rope, and dropped it to the ground. Everything inside was rotten. The freeze-dried meals, somehow they'd become soggy and foul-smelling, like they'd been left in standing water for a week. The smell made me gag. Even the sealed packages looked waterlogged. Nathan emerged from his tent. God, what is that stench? I held up a ruined bag of freeze-dried beef stroganoff. This, I have no idea how it happened. We both stared at it, baffled. There were no punctures in the packaging, like something had seeped through plastic and foil. The entire supply was spoiled. Nathan checked his own stock of canned goods. His was intact, though suspiciously dented. We had no explanation for it. We cleaned up as best we could, burying the ruined stuff far from camp to avoid attracting wildlife. Rex wouldn't go near the burial spot, just whined and paced. After that, I felt uneasy, but tried to push down my anxiety. Things happen in the wild. Humidity, mold, I had no idea. I also had some protein bars left in a separate backpack pocket, so at least I wasn't completely out of food. We decided to explore the area a bit, see if the map was accurate about the location of the stream. I pulled out my phone for a quick check. The battery was at 30%. The phone had been off all night. That made no sense. I shrugged it off and used a physical map. We followed the creek downstream to see if it connected to a bigger river. The map insisted we were half a mile from a side trail, but we never found it. We walked in the same direction for nearly 2 hours and ended up looping back to camp, as if the forest had rearranged itself. At one point, I tried using my compass again. It started spinning, then got stuck pointing directly behind me. Nathan, half joking, said maybe we were in the Bermuda Triangle of the North. I tried to laugh it off, but Rex let out a single bark. It wasn't playful or excited. It sounded almost like a warning. We came back to our site to find the tents disturbed, like something had rummaged around but nothing was taken. The only weird thing was a photograph that I found stuck inside my sleeping bag. A small, creased Polaroid of me and my ex-wife on our wedding day. I had burned all those pictures a few months back. I was so sure I'd destroyed every one. I stared at it, my hands shaking. I didn't want to accuse Nathan of a cruel prank, but the alternative was even more frightening. Did I bring it by accident? I didn't see how. My mind felt scrambled. Nathan saw it too, asked if I was okay. I just nodded and stuffed the photo away, unsettled beyond words. Darkness came faster than the night before. Clouds were thick, no stars visible. We tried to start a fire with the logs we'd gathered, but the same thing happened. It sparked for maybe 10 minutes, flickered in odd colors, then died as if starved of oxygen. We ended up using flashlights for a while, though we were careful to conserve battery. Nathan made a comment about the weirdness of everything. Dying electronics, rotting food, the compass. "You think this place is haunted or something?" he joked, but I heard the shakiness in his voice. I forced a laugh. Just weird coincidences. Still, neither of us wanted to address the fear creeping into our guts. Even Rex seemed spooked. He wouldn't settle down and kept sniffing around the perimeter. Eventually, we retreated to our tents again, feeling the cold seep in. Wind rattled the trees. Around midnight, my phone lit up, randomly. I glanced at the screen. It read 3:33, which was impossible given that it had to be earlier. The phone blinked, then went black. I tried to turn it on. Dead battery. This time for good. I had a small power bank, but I felt too unnerved to fumble around for it in the dark. I stuffed the phone aside and tried to sleep. It felt like I'd only closed my eyes for a minute when I heard a loud, shrill bark. Rex! I shot up. My tent was lit by a pale glow. I realized it was dawn. So, somehow, I'd slept the entire night, but the memory of it was fuzzy. My head pounded, like I'd been drugged. I scrambled out of the tent and saw Rex sprinting along the tree line, barking furiously. "Nathan!" I called. No response. I ran to Nathan's tent. The flap was open, the sleeping bag half out onto the ground. No sign of Nathan. Rex was halfway across the clearing now, nose to the ground. I sprinted after him, panic rising. Something was terribly wrong. I lost sight of Rex in the thick pines. I called his name again and again, but the only reply was the rustling of branches in the wind. After 10 minutes of searching, I stumbled upon a clearing. Broken branches, scuff marks in the dirt, like a struggle. No blood that I could see, but no sign of either Nathan or Rex. My breath billowed in front of me in cold puffs. I stood there, alone, the forest pressing in on all sides. All my gear was back at camp. I had no phone, no working compass. My best friend and my dog were missing. I felt something primal stirring in my gut, fear of the unknown, of being watched. I retreated to camp. Maybe Nathan had come back a different way, but the campsite was empty. The only sign of disturbance was that my own sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, and the zipper was lying open on the ground outside my tent, as though someone, or something, had crawled in or out while I was asleep. I spent the next few hours circling the nearby area, calling for Nathan and Rex. I found nothing. The trees looked the same in every direction. I started noticing weird markers, like piles of stones arranged in small circles, or animal skulls perched on branches. They looked old, but also too deliberate. At one point, I found a cluster of fresh footprints, some human, but the pattern was bizarre. It almost looked like the footprints doubled back on themselves, or repeated side by side, forming a neat row. I couldn't tell if they were mine, Nathan's, or someone else's entirely. Finally, exhausted, I returned to camp. I rummaged through Nathan's tent for clues. On top of his sleeping bag, I found a rusty hunting knife I'd never seen before, with smears of something dark on the blade. My stomach lurched. Blood? I didn't want to think about it. I tried to calm myself, forcing down the swirling panic. Nathan was out there, maybe just lost. I had to keep a level head. I rummaged in my pack for a snack. Found only the protein bars. My water filter was clogged somehow, no matter how hard I pumped. I had maybe 1 day's worth of drinkable water left unless I wanted to boil water over a fire that refused to stay lit. My rational mind told me I had to walk back to the car and get help. But the path we took to get here seemed almost erased. I decided to try anyway. If I moved quickly, I could at least find a ridgeline or something, then get a phone signal. I wrote a quick note, "Nate, if you see this, I'm heading back to the car for help. David," and pinned it under a rock by his tent. Then I grabbed the essentials. My pack, a small pot, the protein bars, a flashlight, and the knife. I didn't want to leave my tent behind, but it was too bulky. As a final gesture, I whistled for Rex. No answer. I don't know how long I walked. My watch said noon when I started, but it didn't change. It stuck at 12 o'clock for hours. The sun was hidden by clouds, so I couldn't gauge time well. The forest felt endless, the trails winding. Twice, I could have sworn I saw the same crooked pine with a knothole that resembled an owl's face. I tried marking trees with my knife, but once or twice I came upon trees that were already marked. Identical marks. My head spun. At some point, I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled around. No one there. Then I heard my own name echo faintly in the distance. The voice sounded like my father's. David, David. Impossible. He'd been dead for months. I covered my ears, biting back a scream. The wind picked up, driving me forward until I emerged into an area of shorter pines. My heart soared. I thought I'd stumbled onto a known path or clearing, but I recognized a rock formation. I was back at my camp. Hours or perhaps minutes had passed and I'd done a full loop, but the camp was different. Everything was disturbed. The tents, the gear, even the ground looked churned. My tent had its door unzipped again, flapping in the breeze. I approached cautiously. Inside lay the photograph of me and my ex-wife, pinned to the tent floor with a stick, as though someone had left it there. A twisted calling card. Trembling, I eased over to Nathan's tent, and that's when I found Rex. He was propped against the side of the tent as if someone had carefully placed him there. My eyes refused to process what I was seeing. Rex's body was mutilated, the fur on his sides missing. He'd been skinned in patches. His muzzle was open, teeth bared in a silent snarl. The ground beneath him was stained dark. I fell to my knees, retching. My vision blurred with tears. I kept whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." But to whom? To the dog who trusted me, or to the father whose lessons I'd neglected? I have no idea how long I stayed like that, kneeling next to my best friend's corpse. Eventually, a sharp snap of a twig made me jerk upright. Something was out there. I lifted my head, face streaked with tears. Anger and grief clashed with raw fear inside me, forging something desperate and dangerous in my chest. I clutched the hunting knife, though my hands shook. He stepped out from behind a pine tree, Nathan, but he was different. His hair was disheveled, his eyes hollow, and a strange grin warped his mouth. He carried a heavy branch, but not like a cane, like a weapon. "Nate," I whispered, half in relief, half in terror. "Oh God, you're here. Where did you go?" He fixed me with a stare. "Where did I go?" he parroted, voice empty. "What do you mean? What happened to you? I've been looking for you. Rex is—" My voice caught in my throat. Nathan blinked once, too slowly, like he had to think about how to do it. Then he let out a small chuckle. "Rex is dinner," he said softly. My blood ran cold. "What the hell did you say?" "Rex," he repeated. "Dinner." Then he took a step forward. I staggered backward, my knife trembling in my fist. "Nate, snap out of it, man. You're not yourself. Did you kill him?" He cocked his head like a curious animal. "Not me." "Then who?" He let out a slow breath, an exhalation that sounded more like the hiss of an animal than a human. "We are hungry," he said, as though that explained everything. His grin widened, too many teeth showing. He took another step. I pointed the blade at him. "Stay back, or I swear to God," he snarled, lips curling. It sounded like my father's growl when he used to get angry, though that was impossible. My father never growled exactly like that, but the timbre was heartbreakingly familiar. Nathan's voice was layered with something else, an echo of something ancient and cruel. Then, in a blink, he lunged. He swung the branch at my head. I ducked, and the impact whistled past my ear. I lashed out with the knife, catching him across the forearm. He hissed but didn't bleed. Instead, black fluid seeped from the wound. We circled each other. My heart thundered so hard I thought it would burst. Nathan, if it was truly him, stared at me with those dead eyes. Then he let out a sound between a laugh and a bark. "You can't get away," he said in a voice that no longer sounded like his at all. "You're ours now." A flicker of movement. He attacked again, too fast. He slammed the branch into my shoulder, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through me, my vision dotted with sparks. I struggled to protect myself as he raised the branch for a final blow. At the last second, I kicked out at his knee. He staggered, giving me an opening. I scrambled up and sprinted away, ignoring the pain in my shoulder. I careened through the forest, branches whipping my face. My mind reeled at the impossibility of it all. That thing was wearing my friend's face, or it had changed him. The voice it used, the presence it radiated, was inhuman. When I finally slowed, I realized how lost I was. My breath rasped, my muscles burned. Something behind me cracked a twig, and I jolted, spinning around. Nothing. I limped forward, trying to find somewhere, anywhere safe. Stumbling upon a rocky outcropping, I saw a small cave or hollow beneath. Desperate, I ducked inside. It was cramped, damp, with an earthy smell. I sank against the back wall, hugging my knees, listening. My shoulder throbbed, the bruise from that branch blow pulsing with every heartbeat. Minutes or hours passed. I had no sense of time. The forest outside grew dim, or maybe the clouds just thickened. The hush was absolute, broken only by my ragged breathing. At some point, I heard movement outside the cave, a scraping, shuffling sound. I tensed, gripping my knife. It happened again, closer, accompanied by a voice that whispered, "David." My father's voice, then, "David," in my ex-wife's voice. Soft, almost melodic. I squeezed my eyes shut. "This isn't real," I muttered. "It's not real." Silence returned. Eventually, thirst forced me to move. I realized I still had my small pot. If I could find water and maybe start a fire, I could boil it. My mind latched onto that small, practical task as a lifeline. So I crept out of the cave. It took me an eternity of searching, but I finally came across a thin rivulet trickling down some mossy rocks. I collected as much as I could in my pot. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw Nathan again, only he was changed even more. His shirt was torn and he was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Where the fingers should have been, the flesh looked blackened, as though burned. His eyes shone with a sickly luminescence. He stared at me, that twisted grin creeping across his face. Then he whispered, "Help me." Part of me wanted to run. Another part clung to the faint hope that some shred of the real Nathan remained. I swallowed. "Nate?" He took a staggering step. "It's inside me," he rasped. "It wore my skin." Then he let out a low moan, doubling over in pain. "Get it out!" I approached cautiously, knife at my side. "How?" What can I do? He looked up, tears streaking his face. Kill me. I froze. I can't. He closed his eyes, tears dropping to the forest floor. Then run. Suddenly, his body stiffened. His eyes opened, and that old grin returned, but his tears kept falling, making the expression nightmarish. No, no, he said, in a voice that was half his own, half something else. Stay, we should be friends. A darkness flickered behind his eyes. I remembered the rotting food, the color-shifting flames, the compass spinning. The stories about shapeshifters or skinwalkers, creatures that thrived on isolation and fear. I'd never believed in them. But what else explained everything? As if reading my thoughts, Nathan, or the thing controlling him, spoke. You humans always think you're alone, until you realize you're never truly alone. His mouth contorted. We watch. We wait. We take. Before I could react, he lunged. I tried to dodge. He slammed into me, sending both of us tumbling down the slope. We crashed through branches, the pot of water clanging away. My knife flew from my hand. The world blurred. I tasted blood in my mouth and my ribs felt battered. We rolled to a stop against a fallen log. Nathan pinned me, panting. Black fluid oozed from his mouth. I thrashed, kicked. My hand scrabbled for anything. Rocks, branches. My palm closed on a small flare from an outer pocket of my pack. The bright orange tube. I had brought 2 flares in case of an emergency rescue signal. Desperate, I flicked off the cap. The movement drew Nathan's attention. But too late. He tried to grab my wrist as I lit the flare in his face. A burst of red and white sparks ignited, searing our vision. Nathan howled, the black fluid sizzling like tar. I pressed the flare forward, jamming it at his eye. The shriek that tore from his lips was otherworldly. He staggered back, clutching his face. The stench of burning flesh and something worse, rotten eggs or sulfur, filled my nostrils, nearly making me vomit. I scrambled up, ignoring the pain. Nathan thrashed, black blood splattering the ground. He jerked away from me, half blind, and bolted off into the trees. I heard him howling, whimpering, and then the forest swallowed him. I collapsed against a rock, adrenaline draining. My entire body trembled, and I couldn't stop gasping. Had I just killed him? Not quite. I could still hear him screaming in the distance. Had I saved him? Probably not. The thing inside him was likely more enraged than wounded. Eventually, I forced myself to move. My left ankle hurt like hell, possibly sprained from the tumble. My shoulder ached fiercely, and my ribs were tender. But I was alive, and I had to get out. I considered going back to bury Rex, but the mere thought of returning to that camp made my stomach churn. The memory of him flayed open would haunt me forever, no matter what. If I stayed here, I might meet the same fate. I limped onward in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. Each step was agony. At times, my vision swam. I wasn't sure how I stayed conscious. The sun, or the gray light that passed for it, dipped lower, and I realized night might fall soon. Panic gnawed at me. I had no working phone, no clear path, minimal supplies. The forest felt infinite and malevolent. But then, as I crested a small ridge, I saw something I never thought I'd see again. A worn footpath, one with actual footprints and the occasional marker. My heart soared. I followed it, hobbling as quickly as I could. Maybe an hour passed in a blur. Eventually, I heard voices. Actual human voices, not illusions. I stumbled through the brush into a campsite. A small group of weekend hikers around a bright campfire, exchanging horrified looks as I collapsed. They rushed to help, but I barely managed a few words. Nathan, dog, attacked, something in the woods. Then everything went black. I woke in a hospital in Farmington, Maine, 3 days later. My ankle was wrapped, my shoulder taped, and my face was bruised and cut. They told me the hikers had radioed a forest ranger who airlifted me out. No sign of Nathan or my dog. No sign of any campsite or weird anomalies either. The official explanation was that I'd suffered a violent robbery or assault by a deranged vagrant. The photos from our site, if any existed, never came to light. The authorities asked me questions I couldn't answer. They didn't believe my story about supernatural forces or shapeshifters. My accounts of time distortion, rotting supplies, and color-changing fires were dismissed as delirium or possibly hallucinations brought on by head trauma, dehydration, or hypothermia. No remains of Rex were ever found. No sign of Nathan, though he was listed as missing. I tried to protest, to show them my bruises, the half-burned flare tube, but they just patted my hand or scribbled notes. After a week, they discharged me. They said if I remembered more details, I should call. That was it. Case closed. That was 2 months ago. I still can't sleep more than a few hours without waking in terror, hearing my father's voice calling my name. Sometimes I dream about that grin, the black fluid dripping from Nathan's eyes. I dream about Rex, always at my side in the forest, only to look down and see him skinned and howling silently. I've researched every local legend I can find. Skinwalkers, wendigos, shapeshifters, ghosts. Nothing fits perfectly, but everything is close enough to keep me awake at night. My mind can't make sense of it, but I know what I saw. People ask me why I don't just forget it, live my life. In many ways, I'm trying to. I'm writing this all down not just as a confession, but as a warning. If you ever consider going deep into Bigelow Preserve, don't. Or if you do, for God's sake, don't go alone. If you see someone you recognize out there, but something about them is off, run. Because there are things in those woods that want to lure you in, to take your skin, your memories, and replace them with unspeakable horrors. Some nights, I sit on my couch, ignoring the flickering TV in front of me, glancing at my reflection in the dark screen. I swear, sometimes my reflection moves a second too late, like it's not perfectly synced with my actions. My eyes look sunken, and the bags beneath them are huge. Sometimes I catch myself smiling when there's nothing to smile about. And when I blink, I do it once, slowly, as if remembering how. It's probably just paranoia, some leftover trauma from that ordeal. But sometimes I wonder if I truly made it out alone. If maybe, in some unexplainable way, it followed me home. The rangers told me I was lost for 4 days, but my sense of it says I was gone at least a week, maybe longer. Time slipped for me in those woods, and maybe it's still slipping. So that's my story, believe it or don't. It doesn't matter. The missing posters for Nathan Briggs will likely remain unsolved. No one but me will ever remember Rex, the best friend I could have asked for. And whatever lurks out in those pines near Cranberry Peak, it's still there. Maybe that's the worst part, knowing it lives on, waiting for the next lost soul to wander too far. And every so often I look at my own hands, half expecting to see black fluid seeping from my nails. I listen for that hiss in the back of my throat. Most times, I don't hear it. But in the quiet after midnight, when the world is dark and still, sometimes I almost think I do. And I realize, maybe I never left those woods at all. My name is Jack Rowley, and I was 36 years old when these events took place. It was late October 2023, the end of a long restless year, when I decided to hike deep into Bigelow Preserve near Flagstaff Lake, Maine, for what I thought would be a peaceful 5-day solo trip. I was never the type to spook easily, but what happened on that mountain still haunts me. I'm writing this now, as plainly as I can, because I've discovered that if I don't tell my story, I might not be able to convince myself any of it was real. I worked in IT for over a decade, spending most days slouched behind a keyboard, fighting off back pain and carpal tunnel while my mind desperately wanted some open air. The final push came when a close friend at work dropped dead from a stress-induced heart attack. It made me reevaluate my own life decisions, and I decided I needed a break. Real wilderness, no cell phone, no laptop. So I planned a 5-day solo hike through Bigelow Preserve, partly to mark the anniversary of my younger brother's death. He had died on a hiking trip 5 years before. And partly to prove I could live, even briefly, without the digital tether always yanking me back. I arrived at the parking area near Flagstaff Lake around noon. The map I had was printed on good quality paper, circled with the route I intended to take. My gear was standard: good boots, a sturdy backpack with freeze-dried rations, a tarp for shelter, first aid kit, and a few luxury items like a paperback and a portable camping stove. My dog, Max, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, hopped out of the SUV with me, tail waving. He was more excited than I'd seen him in weeks. Before I left the car, I switched off my phone, letting the battery die on purpose. I had no intention of using technology out here. I remember feeling a strange hush that first afternoon. The forest was alive, but subdued, as if it knew winter's approach. Leaves had turned to gold and red, carpeting the path. My plan was to hike 4 or 5 miles in, set up a small base camp, and then do day hikes deeper into the preserve. It wasn't too cold yet, just crisp, maybe 50 degrees by midday. My breath wasn't visible, but there was a definite bite in the air when the breeze kicked up. Max padded beside me, occasionally pausing to sniff the underbrush. Every once in a while he bristled, but I chalked that up to a deer or possibly a fox. The area was known for moose, too, so I kept an eye out. I'd read enough about moose attacks to be wary of them, especially in rutting season. But the entire day we didn't see a single large mammal, no deer, no moose. The only creature that scampered across our path was a single red squirrel that chattered loudly at Max. By dusk, I reached a level clearing near a shallow creek. I decided to make my first camp there. Setting up took no time at all. I had a small one-person tent, which I pitched under a canopy of tall, skeletal pines. Max got comfortable immediately, trotting around to mark territory and sniffing at the water. I built a ring of stones for a fire pit, collected a bit of dried brush and small twigs, and struck a match. The flames caught instantly, giving me confidence that I'd have no trouble cooking my dinner. After a freeze-dried meal of chili, I sat back, letting the warmth seep into my bones. As darkness set in, the forest quieted more than usual. It was normal for animal sounds to diminish at night, but the silence felt heavy, like a presence rather than an absence. In the periphery of the firelight, I caught flickers of movement in the trees. Max's ears twitched. A few times he let out a low growl, but when I shone my flashlight toward the darkness, there was nothing but branches and pine needles. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, Max curling up at my feet. The hush was comforting in its own way. I drifted off, lulled by the forest's stillness, and half remembering the reason for this trip. Closure. For me, and for the memories of my brother Jason, who'd been lost to a ravine in upstate Vermont on a hike not too different from this. I tried not to think of Jason's last day. In the middle of the night, I woke to something calling my name. Soft, barely more than a whisper, but definitely there. I jerked upright, heart pounding, and flicked on my flashlight. Max was alert, ears forward, hackles raised. I listened carefully, but the only sound was the low hiss of dying embers. Figuring it was some half-dream or a trick of the wind, I forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, the camp felt off. My sleeping bag was unzipped and spread open as if I'd crawled out in a hurry, but I remembered climbing out carefully. My backpack was sitting out in the open, but all the pockets were undone. Supplies were scattered: dried rations, water purifier, and a small med kit. None of it was missing, just rummaged through. At first, I assumed maybe Max had pawed at it for a treat, but Max never messed with my pack in the past. If anything, he was trained not to do that. I found my phone, which I'd powered off, lying in the dirt. The battery was dead, a final 0%. This was normal enough since I'd let it drain, but I felt uneasy that it was out of its usual spot in my rucksack. After a quick breakfast, I tried to start a small fire to heat water for coffee, but the fire wouldn't stay lit. Each time I struck a match, the flames would catch for a moment, then sputter out as if someone were gently blowing on them. The wood was dry enough, and I had tinder. It should have been fine. A mild frustration, nothing more. Or so I tried to tell myself. Putting it down to damp conditions or a faulty lighter, I packed up camp and pressed on deeper into the wilderness. The sky was slightly overcast, giving the morning a grayish hue. I followed the marked trail for a while, keeping an eye out for the blazes on the trees. After an hour, I realized the trail wasn't matching my map. According to the topography, I should have reached a small footbridge crossing a creek, but there was nothing but thick stands of pine. Eventually, I ended up on a wide rocky stretch that led upward. I took out my compass, at least that still worked, and tried to get a bearing. The path was meandering west-northwest, which was fine, but the problem was the large ridges I was seeing in the distance that didn't correspond to anything printed. I had a sinking feeling I was reading the map incorrectly, or I'd taken some branching path that wasn't listed. My frustration grew, especially when Max began whining, refusing to go any further. He dug his nails into the dirt, standing stock still. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, tugging his leash gently. He never needed it, but I'd clicked one on after seeing how nervous he was. "It's okay." He stared at me with big brown eyes and gave a low whine, but he followed, albeit reluctantly. By noon, I was in a dense grove of pines. The ground was soft and mossy, my boots sinking slightly. That's when I noticed the swirling dryness in the air. Pine needles rustled on the ground, but I felt no wind. The air seemed to move in circles around me, leaves twisting at odd angles. Max's ears kept flicking, as though hearing a high-pitched whistle beyond my range. I tried to ignore it, focusing on picking a good campsite for the afternoon. If I was truly off course, I'd need to reevaluate my plan. I decided to set up early, gather plenty of firewood before dark, and study the map to see if there was any logical route out. If I had to cut the trip short and retrace my steps back to the car, so be it. The entire point was to escape stress, not invite more of it. I found a relatively open spot near a large boulder, a small trickle of water running down its side. It wasn't ideal, but it provided a vantage point if I needed to scan around. I cleared away debris, pitched my tent, and gathered a hefty pile of firewood. This time, the fire caught easily, though the flames burned with a slight bluish tinge around the edges. It might have been an effect of sap in the wood or some local mineral, or so I tried to rationalize. Sitting there, I read a few pages from my paperback, an old battered copy of Treasure Island, while Max dozed near the tent. The day drifted by uneventfully, but my skin tingled with an odd sense of being watched. More than once I peered up from my reading, sure I'd see a shape or silhouette behind the trees, but each time the forest was empty. A few times I thought I heard voices in the distance, like children laughing softly, but it must have been the wind in the pines. As the sky darkened, I cooked another freeze-dried meal, fed Max, and tried to get comfortable. It was chilly, so I unrolled my sleeping bag and propped it against a log by the fire, letting its warmth seep in before bed. I was ready to turn in when I heard it again, a low, calling voice that said, "Max, come here." The exact words I might use if I were calling my dog. But I wasn't calling him. I was standing right there, mouth shut. Max's ears perked. He rose, hackles standing on end, but didn't move toward the voice. It came again. "Max, come here." A perfect imitation of my own pitch and intonation. My chest constricted. That was me, but not me. The voice came from somewhere to the west, beyond the firelight. Then I noticed Max was trembling, tail tucked between his legs. I took a deep breath, picked up my flashlight and pointed it into the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted. No response. I scanned the trees. Pale birches and looming pines wove patterns of black and silver. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to walk a few yards beyond the safety of the fire. "Hello?" I tried again. Silence. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around. A shape flickered between the trunks. Tall, thin, human maybe. I couldn't see details, only a fleeting movement that vanished. I backed away, suddenly realizing how exposed I was. The hair on my arms stood up and I retreated to the fire. For good measure, I fed the flames more wood until they roared bright. No way was I going to sleep yet. Still, as midnight approached, exhaustion took over. I brought Max into the tent with me and laid awake, listening to the small hours. I must have dozed off eventually. Then, I woke to another sound, rustling near the tent flap. My eyes snapped open. Max was growling softly. Through the thin nylon, I saw a shape stooping over our fire pit, rummaging. My mind raced. Could it be a desperate hiker, an animal, a burglar? We were in the middle of nowhere, so a burglar was unlikely. I reached for my flashlight and my small camping knife. Slowly, I unzipped the tent, careful not to rustle the material too loudly. In the dying glow of the coals, I spotted a figure squatting. Its limbs looked twisted, arms and legs oddly angled. It seemed to be wearing a coat, but the shape was all wrong. At the slight zip of my tent, it snapped its head around, revealing a pale face that might have been human once, but looked shifted, like the bones had been rearranged. A jolt of terror shot through me. I scrambled backward, yanking Max's collar, and yelled out. The figure let out a low hiss, somewhere between a human gasp and an animal snarl, then darted off into the tree line in a blur of impossible speed. My heart hammered. Max barked uncontrollably, straining at the tent's entrance. I stumbled out, scanning the darkness with a flickering flashlight, but I saw nothing. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I discovered my packs were missing. Both of them, including the day pack with my water purifier and cooking gear. I eventually found them hanging high in a pine about 100 yards away, the contents doused in some foul liquid that stank like rotting eggs and gasoline. I almost vomited at the smell. Most of my freeze-dried rations were soggy, the wrappers dissolved. Only a few were salvageable. My water bladder had been punctured. The worst part was the inside of the packs, where I found a tangle of hair. Dark, coarse hair, knotted and stuffed like someone's scalp had been emptied into the bag. In the midst of that discovery, I felt my fingers prickling. I pulled off my gloves to see blisters forming around my fingernails, red welts that looked like infection or chemical burns. It made no sense. I'd worn gloves while gathering wood. The sores were painful, tiny throbs that made me grit my teeth. I used up most of my antibiotic cream from the first aid kit on them. At this point, I considered leaving, but I was disoriented by the missing landmarks and the lack of a clear path. I told myself if I headed east long enough, I'd eventually cross the main trail or run into Flagstaff Lake. But my map seemed worthless now. I kept seeing unmarked ridges and streams. Once again, I tried to rely on my compass, but something about the forest felt fluid, like it was rearranging itself just beyond my vision. Sometimes, the same rocky outcropping appeared in front of me twice. Twice, I passed the same giant boulder with a cracked top. By mid-afternoon, I was in such a panic that I nearly started running, blindly ignoring the risk of twisting an ankle or stumbling onto dangerous ground. Then, just as the sun sank behind the ridges, I spotted someone standing near a clearing in the distance. My heart leapt. A person, maybe a ranger or another hiker. I ran forward, Max at my side. As I got closer, relief and confusion mixed. It was Erin Blake, my ex-girlfriend from nearly a year ago. She looked half frozen, her dark hair matted against her cheeks. I was stunned speechless because I had never told her where I was going. In fact, we hadn't spoken in months. "Erin," I gasped. "What? How are you?" She stumbled forward and I saw bruises on her arms. "Jack," she croaked, tears in her eyes. "Thank God, I got lost. I've been wandering for 2 days." I pulled her into a quick hug. Her body felt warm, but she trembled uncontrollably. Confusion rattled in my brain. "You got lost out here? But how did you even know?" I trailed off. She just kept shaking her head, saying she'd come to Maine for a solo trip, saw my car, recognized it, and decided to follow my route. Something had chased her at night. She fell and hit her head. I couldn't make sense of it, but I didn't want to push too hard while she was so distressed. With barely enough daylight to set up a makeshift camp, we found a flat spot under a stand of fir trees. Erin asked if I had any extra food, and I shared what little I had left. She devoured it. We had almost no water, but she said she knew of a small stream half a mile away. Maybe in the morning we could find it. She also claimed she remembered a ranger station from a previous trip near the southwestern corner of the preserve. If we could just get our bearings, we might head that way. Despite the terror of the last 2 days, I was relieved not to be alone. Even Max seemed to warm up to her presence. It was strange, though. She asked me about things that never happened. She said, "Remember when we went skiing in Colorado and you broke your wrist?" But we'd never skied in Colorado. Or the time we supposedly celebrated her birthday in Boston with her cousin. I had no recollection of that. At first, I assumed she was mixing me up with another ex-boyfriend or that her head injury caused confusion. Still, it felt off. When night fell, we managed to start a small fire that burned in blues and greens. A sign of copper or other minerals, I told myself. I expected Erin to ask about the strange color, but she didn't remark on it. Instead, she stared into the flames with a focused intensity, as if listening to a voice inside them. Max, curled at my side, occasionally gave her these uncertain looks. Once, I caught him baring his teeth at her when she wasn't looking. She told me in halting whispers about something that had followed her. She'd glimpsed it from the corner of her eye. A tall, twisted figure moving between trees. Sometimes, it spoke to her in her own voice, or in my voice, or in some guttural whisper she couldn't quite make out. She said she'd found a dead deer, hung upside down from a branch, entrails swinging. I believed her instantly because it matched the bizarre rummaging I'd experienced at my camp. My chest tightened with dread. We decided to sleep in shifts. She insisted on taking the first watch. Exhausted, I agreed. I crawled into my tent with Max, pulling him close so I could feel the warmth of his body. It was a fitful, anxious rest. At one point, I half awoke to the sound of Erin muttering outside, though I couldn't understand her words. Something about the rhythm of her voice made my skin crawl. It sounded like she was chanting. At dawn, I found the fire still blazing, which should have been impossible given our limited firewood. Erin knelt beside it, wide-eyed. "I fed it," she said softly. "I had to keep it going. It's the only thing that keeps it away." Her voice trembled on the word "it." She was still wearing the same clothes as the day before. and I realized with a jolt that her bruises seemed different, almost faded. I asked if she was hurt, if she needed bandages, but she shook her head. "No, I'm okay," she said in a tone that felt off, like she wasn't actually reassuring me, just repeating a memorized line. We set out, searching for the stream she swore was close by. We combed the woods for an hour. The forest grew denser and more labyrinthine. Twisted branches overhead interlaced so tightly that it felt like being in a green-gray tunnel. Sunlight drifted through in patchy segments. Twice, I stumbled across footprints, but they were oddly shaped, too long, with toe imprints that ended in small divots, as though something walked on the tips of bone-like stumps. Erin said little. She walked a few paces behind me, occasionally humming a tuneless melody. We never found the stream. Around noon, hunger gnawing at my stomach, we paused. Erin insisted she would go look for firewood while I reorganized my gear. I busied myself checking what was salvageable. My med kit was nearly empty. 2 freeze-dried pouches left. My water had run out. I prayed to God the drizzle from the sky would collect on my tarp so we could at least sip something. I was so absorbed that I barely noticed how long Erin had been gone. Max whined, pacing. I realized it must have been at least an hour since Erin vanished among the pines. A stab of concern urged me to follow her tracks. I whistled for her, then called her name. No reply. Max bounded into the undergrowth. I followed, pushing through branches that scratched my face. The ground turned marshy, my boots making sucking noises with each step. At last, I emerged into a small clearing, and there she was, kneeling over a pile of damp branches. She didn't look up when I approached. She was very still, her arms hanging limp. "Erin?" I said carefully. No answer. I circled around, dread pooling in my gut. Her eyes stared straight ahead, the pupils shrunken. A twisted grin spread across her face like a rictus that didn't belong to her. The hair on my neck rose. "Erin?" I tried again. She blinked, slowly, unnaturally, and turned her head to me. "I was gathering wood," she said in a voice a half octave too deep. I got lost. The way she said it, mechanical, forced, made my stomach clench. Then, without warning, she lunged at me. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping. She didn't strike me, though. Her hands just hovered near my face, trembling. Then she stopped, eyes wide as if waking from a trance. She blinked rapidly, tears forming. "Jack, I don't feel well," she whispered, voice back to normal. I helped her stand, ignoring the adrenaline shaking my limbs. "We have to get out of here," I said. She didn't argue. We returned to our makeshift camp, half dragging the soggy firewood. Something wasn't right with Erin. She kept forgetting details, like how we met or the name of my dog. She called him Buddy, even though I'd told her 100 times that his name was Max. That afternoon the rain started, a cold, steady drizzle. We holed up under the tarp. Erin dozed, her breathing shallow. Max lay near her, occasionally sniffing her hair as if trying to confirm something. Night fell quickly under the storm clouds. In near total darkness, I tried to start the fire again with the wet wood, but it was hopeless. Every few minutes, lightning flashed, revealing the contorted trees overhead. My sense of time began to warp. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the unrelenting gloom. But it felt like hours passed in the space of minutes, and then minutes felt like hours. I must have dozed off at some point, though it was more like drifting in and out of anxious delirium. I woke to a choking sound. Lightning illuminated the campsite. Erin was hunched over Max, apparently carving something into his side with a flint shard. My dog whimpered, struggling. Blood glistened. An electric jolt of horror shot through me. I lunged forward, screaming, "What are you doing?" My voice cracked. I grabbed at the shard, and Aaron actually hissed at me, baring teeth that looked too long in the half-light, as if her mouth stretched inhumanly. I tackled her, ignoring the snap of thunder overhead. She bucked beneath me with unnatural strength. Then, with a final wrench, she tore herself free and scuttled backward on all fours, her eyes black in the fleeting glare of lightning. I scrambled over to Max. His flank was slashed with bizarre symbols, shapes that looked almost alphabetical but not in any language I'd seen. He was bleeding, whining, eyes wide with terror. My rage boiled over. "What the hell did you do?" Erin stared, grinning. "He needs to feed," she rasped in that too-deep voice. Then her head jerked back as if something tugged from behind. She shrieked in a mix of fury and sorrow, then bolted into the darkness. I didn't chase her. My priority was Max. I found my first aid kit, a meager supply of gauze and disinfectant, trying to stanch the bleeding. The cuts were deep, but if I could clean them properly and bandage them, maybe he'd be okay. My hands shook uncontrollably. Part of me prayed that Aaron was hallucinating, that this was all some waking nightmare. But the blood on my fingers was real. Max was in pain, trembling against me. I held him for what felt like hours. The rain battered down, occasionally turning to sleet, soaking us both. I whispered soothing words to him, tears mingling with the rain on my face. My mind swirled with confusion and terror. Was that truly Aaron? Or something wearing her shape? Something that used her memories or bits of them to get close? We stayed there until daybreak, if it could be called daybreak, for the sky was still stormy. The moment there was enough light to see, I carefully guided Max to his feet. He managed to walk, albeit with a limp, favoring his wounded side. I had no illusions about lasting out here another night. Our only hope was to find a real trail or ranger station or any sign of civilization. I was about to strike out when I spotted Aaron, or what was left of her, half hidden behind the trunk of a pine 30 yards away. She stood there, silent, watching me. Her posture was stiff, her head cocked at an unnatural angle. My stomach lurched. I decided confrontation was too dangerous, so I trudged forward, hoping to skirt around her. She didn't move at first, just tracked me with those black eyes. As soon as we passed, I heard her following, snapping twigs underfoot. I turned. She was closer now, face slack, lips parted. "Don't come near me," I warned, voice trembling. Max growled, but it was a weak sound. She stepped forward, and I raised the small camping knife. Lightning flashed again, though the storm was supposed to have abated. A hollow rumble of thunder rolled across the ridges. Suddenly, Erin's face twisted in an expression of deep sorrow. "Jack," she croaked, her voice normal again. "Help me. I'm stuck. It's inside me." She sank to her knees, tears on her cheeks. "Please. I'm so cold." I took a hesitant step forward, pity warring with fear. But in the next instant, her expression snapped back to the wide, unnatural grin. Her jaw cracked audibly, unhinging like a snake's. I stumbled backward in revulsion, clutching Max's collar. She lunged, and I slashed blindly with the knife. The blade grazed her arm. She made no sound, but recoiled from the silver plating near the handle, as if it burned her. I realized that old camping knife had a silver overlay that was mostly decorative. That seemed to hurt her. Her eyes rolled back, revealing only white. In a motion too quick to track, she sprang away into the undergrowth, leaving me trembling and drenched, knife clutched in a white-knuckle grip. I wasted no time. We pressed on, forging through dense brush, my wet boots squelching with each step. Everything around me felt off kilter. The sunlight didn't match the clock in my head, time expanded and contracted. I'd walk for 5 minutes, and the shadows would shift as though an hour had passed. Other times, I stumbled through the forest for what felt like hours, only to see the sun barely move above the horizon. We reached a steep gully, a winding drop dotted with boulders. As I descended carefully, half sliding on mossy rocks, I found something that made my heart freeze. A body. It was curled awkwardly against a rock face, limbs bent in angles that nature never intended. When I drew closer, I recognized the black hair. It was Erin. The real Erin, or at least a husk of her. The face was sunken, the eyes closed, mouth sewn shut with coarse black threads. Blood had pooled beneath her. She seemed to have been there for days, if not longer, though I'd just spoken to a version of her minutes earlier. My stomach churned. The thing wearing her shape, had it done this? Or had she been dead since she disappeared from her last known location, and some creature found her? I felt numb, a mental break forming in my consciousness. Max whimpered, and I placed a trembling hand on his head, turning us both away from the grotesque sight. Every sensible part of me screamed to run, but I forced myself to rummage for anything that might help. There was nothing. Just a small ring on her left hand, tarnished with blood. I pressed my forehead against a nearby stone, fighting the urge to retch. Whatever was in this forest could wear a human body like a puppet, and with that realization, a greater horror sank in. If I couldn't find my way out soon, I might share her fate. For hours we pushed through the trees. I began to doubt the very concept of direction. Every ridge, every hollow looked the same. My feet bled from blisters. My fingers oozed from the chemical burns or infection. My dog limped beside me, bravely soldiering on despite his wound. The forest itself felt like it was breathing, the light shifting to bizarre angles. A few times I swore I saw my own footprints leading off into the distance only to vanish among the pines. Eventually, near what felt like late afternoon, I came across a rough logging road, or maybe an old utility path. The gravel was patchy, the ruts overgrown, but it was man-made. Relief flooded me. If I followed this road, it might eventually intersect with a better-known route. My pace quickened despite my aches, but I didn't walk long before I saw a small wooden sign hammered into a post. Fire danger high, no campfires. It looked like something the local Forest Service might have posted, but the paint was cracked and peeling, with an older style of lettering I hadn't seen used in decades. I pressed on, ignoring the swirl of confusion. The road led me around a bend, and that's where I found the stone ruin. Maybe an old hunting cabin. The walls were half collapsed, the roof non-existent except for rotting beams. Desperate for any shelter, I limped inside. The air felt stale, reeking of decay. Fallen leaves and branches littered the floor. In one corner I found rusted tools. A battered cot leaned against a wall. I turned back to motion Max inside, but he wouldn't come. He stood at the threshold, whining softly, refusing to cross the stone foundation. I couldn't blame him. The place felt wrong, but I needed rest, so I beckoned him in gently. He took a hesitant step, then he froze, ears flattening. A rumble of thunder in the distance made him flinch. He began barking at something behind me. Heart thudding, I spun around to see a silhouette in the doorway. It was shaped like a person, tall, spindly arms nearly dragging the floor. In the gloom I could make out its face, a pale, stretched parody of human features. It parted its lips, revealing a row of blackened teeth. Then it spoke in a half-wet, half-rasping voice that sounded like every voice it had stolen. "Jack, you're lost." The words twisted my intestines into knots. I raised the silver-tipped knife, voice shaking. "Stay back." Its head tilted. "You're lost. Then it made a sound like a laugh or a cough or both. It leaned closer, limbs creaking. I realized with horror that the face was wearing a patch of dog fur near the jawline, as though it had melted into its flesh. My vision swam with revulsion. Max lunged, despite his wound. The creature swiped at him with an elongated arm. They clashed with snarls and yelps echoing in the tiny ruin. I rushed in, adrenaline spiking. I stabbed at the creature's midsection with the silver overlay, slicing through ragged clothing, or skin, or both. It screamed, an unearthly shriek that rattled the crumbling walls. A wet, acidic stench poured out. The creature convulsed, reeling away from me. In that moment, Max's teeth found its twisted arm. He bit down hard. The creature howled, tossing him aside in a single violent motion. Max hit the wall with a thud, yelping. Rage and terror clouded my mind. I lunged again, driving the knife up under the creature's ribcage. It let out a choked gurgle, then grabbed my wrist with impossible strength, nearly snapping it. The world dimmed. My knees shook. Summoning every ounce of will, I twisted the blade, pushing deeper. The creature's body began to collapse inward, flesh melting to reveal black sinews and bone. With a final tortured shriek, it burst into a spatter of foul liquid and rancid steam. I fell backward, heaving, battered by the stench and the unnatural heat. For a moment, everything was quiet except for my labored breathing and Max's soft whimpers. A sense of relief washed through me. I'd killed it. But some primal part of me doubted it was truly gone. Creatures like this, whatever it was, didn't obey normal rules. Maybe I'd only wounded it. Nonetheless, I hurried to Max, checking his injuries. He was battered but alive. Then I spied something on the floor, a scrap of cloth that looked like the collar of Erin's jacket. My stomach twisted. Perhaps the creature had used pieces of her body to fashion its disguise. My mind threatened to collapse under the horror. Staggering outside, I realized night had fallen again, or else time was so warped that dusk came too soon. The overcast sky glowed faintly, a sickly purple. The logging road beyond the ruin beckoned, and I followed it, half carrying Max. We walked for what felt like hours, my legs screaming in protest. Eventually, the forest thinned. To my shock, I stumbled onto a paved road. Headlights dazzled me, a game warden's truck parked near the shoulder. My heart soared. Civilization. I called out, "Help, please!" My voice was a ragged croak. The warden stepped out, shining a flashlight. He was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a standard uniform. He looked me up and down, alarmed, and hurried over. "Whoa, what happened to you?" I sagged in relief, tears threatening. "Got lost, attacked, my dog's hurt, need help." He helped me into the truck's passenger seat. Warm air blasted from the vents. Max hopped onto the floor, licking at his own wounds. The warden rummaged for a first aid kit. As he dabbed at my blistered fingers, I explained as much as I could without sounding insane. There was an animal that attacked us. We got disoriented, my friend might be missing. The warden frowned, scribbling notes. "You say your name's Jack Rowley?" he asked softly. "Yeah," my voice shook. "I know it sounds crazy, but..." He nodded, flipping open a worn file folder. We found a body near Flagstaff Lake 3 days ago. Mauled to hell. Dog, too. Dental records identified them as Jack Rowley and his German Shepherd." My mind reeled. That's impossible. I'm Jack Rowley right here." I felt a dizzy wave of confusion, remembering that sense of time breaking, fracturing around me. I turned to look at Max. He stared back, panting weakly, real, solid. The warden's face grew strange, his expression flattening. He reached over to pat my shoulder, but his hand lingered too long, fingers curling. "We were certain it was you," he said, and turned his flashlight toward his own face. His eyes were pitch black, no whites or irises, just solid darkness. "So, who are you?" His grin stretched unnaturally wide. A scream built in my throat. Max let out a low, fearful whine. The warden kept smiling. "Don't worry, Jack. We'll figure it out together." His voice lilted with a mocking gentleness, like a teacher coaxing a child. I realized in that horrifying instant that I wasn't safe at all. This was just another form the skinwalker, the marrow tongue, had taken. The air around me seemed to twist, my lungs locked. Every inch of me cried out to run, but I was pinned by exhaustion. Finally, I forced my arm upward, brandishing the silver-tipped knife. The warden's expression flickered with alarm, then settled into a mocking calm. "That won't change what you are now," he said. "What I am?" I croaked. "Don't you remember?" He reached over to open the glove box, revealing an old mirror. He held it up to my face. The reflection was warped by the flickering overhead light, but the shape was not exactly me. My eyes were sunken, my skin too pale, lips cracked and bloodless. In that brief moment, I thought I glimpsed blackness in my own pupils, as if tendrils of shadow coiled inside them. "No," I moaned, trying to reject the sight. Lightning flashed outside, painting the world in a strobe of white. The warden was gone, truck door wide open, just me and Max in the front seats. The empty road stretched ahead. A swirling panic overcame me. Was I hallucinating? Dead? Stuck in some twisted dimension? I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening. If I was still alive and real, maybe I could drive out of here. The keys dangled from the ignition. Max lay on the floor, whimpering but still conscious. I turned the key and the engine coughed to life. Headlights stabbed through the darkness. I pressed the gas. The tires squealed on wet pavement. I drove for what felt like hours, but no sign of houses, no turnoffs, no lights. Just endless black forest. My eyes burned from fatigue. The tension in my chest made me hyperventilate. Once, a deer-like shape darted across the road. Or maybe it was something else, tall and wrong, limbs bending. I nearly crashed trying to swerve around it. Sometime before dawn, I saw the faint outline of a wooden sign. Flagstaff Lake Campgrounds. Relief soared in my chest. If I could just reach that campground, maybe I'd find real people. My foot pressed the accelerator harder. But as I approached the sign, it seemed old, battered by decades of weather. The arrow beneath it pointed down a narrow side road half swallowed by brush. I turned onto it, heart pounding. The headlights illuminated battered picnic tables, a rusted dumpster, and a small wooden kiosk that used to hold brochures. It was deserted. I parked the truck, got out, and half stumbled around, calling for help. My voice echoed emptily. Max limped behind me, favoring his wounded side. We found no one. In desperation, I rummaged through the kiosk, searching for a phone or radio, but everything was destroyed or missing. The drizzle had returned, painting the world in gray gloom. The unstoppable dread in my mind told me that I might be beyond normal reality. I sank onto a bench, burying my face in my hands. Max nudged my elbow, whining softly. All I could do was hold him close, mindful of his injuries. Then the horizon brightened. The storm clouds parted, revealing a bleak, watery sunrise. I stared at the sky for a long time, tears drying on my cheeks, wondering if the creature was truly dead or if it still lingered, waiting. The morning's hush enveloped us. No birds sang, no wind stirred. Just me and Max, alone in the wake of horrors that defied reason. I wish I could say there was closure in that sunrise, that I found a ranger station, got medical help, and returned to my life. But nothing felt certain anymore. My hands shook. My clothes were stiff with dried mud and blood. If I walked down the road in broad daylight, would it lead me back to civilization or deeper into the labyrinth? The truck was still there, but a voice in my mind asked whether that was even real. I glanced at Max. His eyes, though pained, looked normal. He was the only real anchor I had left. Gently, I reached down and stroked his ears. He rested his head on my knee, sighing as if to say, "We keep going." And so that's what we did. I don't fully remember what happened in the hours that followed. It's a haze of stumbling, searching for signs of life. At times, I thought I saw glimpses of other hikers, only for them to vanish behind trees. Once, I heard my own voice echoing from far away, calling my name. After that, I tried not to listen too closely to the forest. Weeks have passed since I staggered into a small roadside motel near a town whose name I can't recall. The proprietor claimed I came limping up from the woods, covered in cuts and half-starved, with a dog half dead from infection. I collapsed in their lobby, delirious. They never saw a truck. According to them, I arrived on foot. They patched us up as best they could, then eventually we made our way to a hospital. That's where I learned that no official game warden was in the area that night, and no truck matching my description existed. The place I ended up was nearly 30 miles from the Bigelow Preserve. I'm still grappling with the nightmares. So is Max. Sometimes at night, he'll bolt upright, hackles raised, and growl at a corner of the room. If I look too long into mirrors in dim light, I see something in my eyes, a flicker of blackness that reminds me too much of that creature. I don't know if it's real or just PTSD. I want to believe it's just trauma. But if you're reading this, I beg you, stay out of those woods. Or, if you must go, don't rely on your map or phone. Don't trust strange voices calling from the trees. Above all, don't trust the shape of anyone you meet out there, even if it's someone you love, or especially if it's someone you love. Because something in that forest isn't just an animal, and it isn't just a spirit. It steals identities, voices, and even memories, wearing them like a suit of flesh. I may have wounded it, or perhaps only angered it. Sometimes, in the dead hours of the night, I hear it again, mimicking my voice from the darkness outside. "Jack, Jack, come here." And I have to fight every instinct not to go see who's calling. I don't know if I'll ever return to Maine or to any forest again. Part of me still dreams of the morning hush, the quiet rustle of leaves. But I remember the final grin of that thing, those black eyes. I remember the rotting stench when it collapsed under my blade. I remember the real Aaron's body, sewn shut and left to decay. Most of all, I remember the game warden's voice as he flipped through the file stating I was found mauled to death. How can that be true? And yet, how can I deny it? Even as I write these words, my hands tremble with uncertain memory. Maybe the forest claimed me. Maybe I'm just a ghost. But if I'm still human, still real, then this is my warning, my testament to a place that devours reality and regurgitates nightmares. They say the Maine woods are vast, untamed, and beautiful. I learned they're also host to something old, cunning, and ravenous. Something that wears the faces of the lost. Something that can even steal time, leaving you stranded in a labyrinth of half-formed days and nights. Whatever it is, if you go looking for solitude in Bigelow Preserve, you may find more than you bargained for. I certainly did. I'm left with only one certainty. I don't trust my own reflection anymore. Because when I stare too long, I swear it stares back. And sometimes it smiles.